Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Hatbox Found Behind the Vestry Door, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marplette. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The vestry door was never locked. The storm had not yet broken, but the clouds hung low and swollen, a heavy grey curtain over the village of St. Mary Mead. The church tower stood sharp against that sky, and from its stone steps a rivulet of rainwater trickled down into the gravel path. It was late, too late for anyone to be about, but the vestry light burned, flickering as though the wind beyond, the narrow windows was determined to snuff it out. Miss Marple had noticed it from her own sitting-room window as she carefully wound her clock for the night. She rarely let things pass unremarked. A light in the vestry so late was a small thing perhaps, but it troubled her. The vicar, Mr. Goodfellow, was punctual as a clock with his habits. He locked up the vestry by 9 each evening. Yet here it was, past 11, and the lantern glowed like a beacon against the gloom. Her instinct was not to interfere. After all, what business was it of hers if the vicar had reason to be working late? And yet, as she sat with her knitting in her lap, she remembered something. The vestry door had been reported faulty at the hinges. Only last Sunday, during tea after the service, Mrs. Price Ridley had remarked, in her sour fashion, that anyone could push it open without so much as the smallest key. Mr. Goodfellow had promised to see to it, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to know promises were one thing and follow through another. The night wore on, and at last the storm broke. Rain came hard against the glass panes, and the wind swept round the cottages like a chorus of unseen mourners. The light in the vestry, however, still burned. That small detail fixed itself in Miss Marple's mind, the way a burr clings to wool. She rose at last, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and resolved to walk past the church before bed. Curiosity was, after all, her truest sin. The graveyard path was slick with rain. Her small, neat figure was nearly swallowed by the storm, but her eyes, bright, penetrating, missed nothing. She saw, for instance, the faint mark of tyre tracks pressed into the muddy verge by the churchyard gate. Not a farmer's cart, she thought, but something lighter, perhaps a motor car. Unusual at such an hour. When she reached the vestry, she tried the door. As she had suspected, it yielded at once beneath her hand. It creaked open, heavy and damp, revealing the warm glow of the lamp within. She stepped in cautiously, and what she saw rooted her to the spot. On the wooden floor, beneath the hanging cassocks, lay the body of a man. His head was twisted at an odd angle, his eyes staring glassily at the beamed ceiling. Rain had pooled on the flagstones around him, mingling with a dark stain that Miss Marple knew at once was not water. Beside him, strangely placed as though it had been left in haste, was a brown felt hat, its brims soaked through. And on the vestry table lay an envelope, torn but not opened, bearing only the words, "To be read in the presence of witnesses." Miss Marple's hand went at once to the bell cord, but she paused. The body was not of a stranger, though she had never known him well. It was Mr. Leonard Harbottle, a solicitor from Much Benham, who had been attending to the affairs of the wealthy Mrs. Arbuthnot only that very week. He was a man disliked by many, envied by some, and trusted by almost no one. That, Miss Marple reflected, was never a safe way to live long. She bent slightly, observing details others might overlook. There was no sign of forced entry, though of course the door had not been locked. The hat, though, intrigued her. It was far too small for Mr. Harbottle, whose head was large and round. And then there was the envelope, addressed so formally, but lying abandoned. She touched it lightly, noting the faintest smear of ink where damp fingers had pressed it. Her mind began its delicate clockwork. If the vestry door was left open, any passerby could have entered. But who had business with Mr. Harbottle here, of all places? He was no churchwarden. He had, however, enemies enough to fill the pews twice over. The sound of hurried footsteps on the gravel broke her thoughts. She straightened her shawl, composed her expression, and stepped aside as the vicar himself burst in, rain streaming down his cassock. His face went white as he saw the body. "Good heavens above," he gasped, clutching the vestry table for support. "Miss Marple, what is this?" "I rather think, Mr. Goodfellow," said Miss Marple calmly, "that it is murder, and a very inconvenient one, in your vestry." He staggered closer, his hands trembling. "Murder? But why, that's Mr. Harbottle. I had an appointment with him tomorrow morning, regarding Mrs. Arbuthnot's estate. How in heaven's name—" His voice broke, and Miss Marple saw more than simple shock. There was fear there too, a very real, pressing fear. She wondered at that. The vicar looked down suddenly, noticing the envelope. He reached for it, but Miss Marple's hand, light though it was, intercepted his. "No, Mr. Goodfellow," she said softly. "That must remain as it is until the authorities arrive. You understand, of course." His eyes flickered. Resentment, perhaps, or guilt, but he withdrew his hand. "Yes, of course. You are right, as always." They stood in silence, the storm beating on the windows. At last he muttered, "I shall telephone Inspector Craddock, at once." He moved away, fumbling for the telephone in the adjoining room. Miss Marple lingered by the body. Her gaze rested again on the hat. Not Harbottle's, no. But whose? She noticed just at the crown a faint embroidery inside, letters stitched by hand, H.P. She tucked that observation carefully into her mental ledger. There was another detail too. On the edge of Harbottle's cuff, almost hidden, was the smudge of candle wax. Odd for a man who prided himself on modern conveniences and had often scoffed at country ways. Where had he brushed against candle wax on such a night? Unless he had been in some place lit by no other means. A locked chamber, perhaps. A secret room. When Inspector Craddock arrived, tall and stern in his raincoat, Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, allowing the official process to begin. She listened, however, as he questioned the vicar, and caught every hesitation in Mr. Goodfellow's voice. She knew, too, that Craddock would note her presence and likely consult her before long. He was not too proud to value her keen observations, however mildly she phrased them. But for now she kept her counsel. She had seen enough to know that this was no simple quarrel gone wrong. The vestry door, so often assumed to be locked, had stood open like a stage curtain, allowing some unseen actor to enter and play out a deadly scene. As the body was covered and the rain began to ease, Miss Marple turned once more to the vestry table. There, beside the envelope, lay a single playing card, sodden and curling at the edges. The Queen of Hearts. No one else had noticed it yet. She slipped it under her gaze, her lips pressing tightly together. A love affair, perhaps, or a cruel joke. She knew one thing for certain. The vestry door was never locked, and that simple fact would unravel every lie that was about to follow. And as she left the church, the storm clouds parting to reveal a thin blade of moonlight, Miss Marple thought grimly that Chapter 2 of this affair had already begun, though none of them, save perhaps herself, knew it yet. Chapter 2. The Hatbox That Shouldn't Exist. At first light, the storm slackened, leaving the village rinsed and shivering as though some vast pail had been tipped over its roofs. From her bedroom window, Miss Marple watched the mist lift off the churchyard like breath from a sleeping beast. The Lichgate's dripping timbers framed the lane beyond, and there, just to the right of the hinge where Ivy always insisted upon returning, Something pale and round had lodged against the railings, half submerged in the puddle that the night's rain had bullied into being. It was the milk boy who saw it first and came pelting up the lane with the news, flinging his bicycle into Miss Marple's hedge without ceremony, breathless and squeaking, "Ma'am, there's a hatbox stuck, as if someone had shoved it there and gone." A hatbox, after a murder in a vestry where an ill-fitting hat had lain so peculiarly close to the body, was not a thing to be dismissed. Miss Marple was out in her shawl in a moment, boots carefully chosen and umbrella unnecessary now that the rain had shredded itself into a thin, fretting drizzle. The box, cream board gone a greyish colour with soaking, its lid strapped crosswise with twine of a sort haberdasher's favour, had wedged itself in the angle of the gate so that one could only have retrieved it by lifting. It had not drifted there on the run-off. It had been placed. The boy's triumph in discovery dwindled to awe as Miss Marple, with the most modest of smiles, said, "Fetch Mr. Goodfellow at once, and tell him to bring Inspector Craddock. We mustn't fuss the thing more than necessary." She did not touch the lid. She did, however, bend near enough to catch a faint breath of something out of place in a morning that smelt of stone and wet grass, powder. Not the violet scent preferred by shopgirls, but the dry and chalkier odour that accompanies dressing tables in houses where things are brushed and folded by a habit rather than a person. The twine had been tied with a neat nurse's knot rather than a shop's hasty bow. Miss Marple nodded to herself, an inward, private nod. A lady's room, a maid's hands, or a nurse's, in haste, but not panic. The vicar came stumbling, his hair still damp from a quickly resumed wash, and paled when he saw the box. "What fresh horror," he breathed. His fear had not lessened with daylight. It clung to him like the damp to his cassock. "It may be nothing of the sort," said Miss Marple gently. "But we shall see." Inspector Craddock's arrival was brisk enough to ruffle the sparrows. He had the look of a man who had slept in his coat and not regretted it. "Hatbox," he said briefly, in the tone of a person prepared not to be surprised. He produced from his pocket the sort of small penknife that gentlemen of his stamp carry for the opening of envelopes rather than the cutting of twine, and glanced at Miss Marple. She had moved a little aside to give him room, but her eyes did not leave the thing. "If you—" "Please," she said. He slit the twine, lifted the lid, and then all of them, as if directed by some stage necessity, leaned in together. Inside lay the brown felt hat that had been beside Mr. Harbottle's body, the felt now dulled darker by damp. It had not been left in the vestry after all. Someone had visited that holy little room again in the small hours, or very early indeed, to fetch it, place it in a box that had not come from any village shop, and wedge it for discovery at the gate. With the hat, there was a folded scrap of something that had wanted to be paper, but had become, under the night's assault, a soft and indecisive mush. Craddock lifted it with 2 fingers. The remnants of letters bloomed faintly in diluted ink. Miss Marple saw the curls of a copperplate H and something like a P. Too smudged to rely upon, but there. Inspector Craddock's mouth made a plain, disliked line. "An obliging murderer," he said, "who would like us to look in a particular direction." Miss Marple, who did not often correct, said with diffidence, "Or an anxious person who wishes us to look away from another." Meaning, "Nothing final," she said. "Only, this is a hatbox that should not be here at all, nor anywhere, quite." He glanced at her, then at the box. It bore, under the twine, 2 labels. One was the oval stamp of a London maker, Bramfield and Company, Piccadilly, well known to gentlemen who like a hat to sit on the brow as naturally as hair. The other, newer and clumsier, was a railway luggage label scribbled in pencil. The station stamp had bled, but in the corner one could still make out the printed words, "Pullman car." And there, very distinctly despite the running of the graphite, A name, Hugh Peveril. Craddock's head came up. The vicar made a soft, involuntary sound of distress, as if something he feared might be true had been obligingly typed out for him. "You know him?" asked Craddock. "Mrs. Arbuthnot's ward," said the vicar, looking anywhere but at Miss Marple. "Or he was. He is, staying at the Hall. A cousin, or some sort of connection. I hoped he would. That is, Mr. Harbottle was to call this morning about a matter of the will." Miss Marple observed the choice of verbs, every one of them skirting the edges of truth as a cat slides round a puddle. She said pleasantly, "Mr. Peveril used to have hair like a hedgerow, and was sent down from his college for an escapade, I believe. He returned from the war with charming manners and much less money. He rides well." The vicar stared. "I did not think you had met him." "I never meet anyone," said Miss Marple, a twinkle escaping into her eyes despite herself. "But people are like wools. Leave them in a basket together and they tangle of their own accord. One must only look at the knot and see which thread is pulling which." Craddock, who trusted threads, if Miss Marple mentioned them, had taken the hat out and turned it against the light. "Small," he said. "Smaller than Harbottle's. Right enough." He peered inside. "And stitched initials, H.P., by hand." "Household work," Miss Marple breathed. "Not a shop. The maker would stamp. A housemaid, or perhaps a nurse, with a small practised needle." "Miss Marple," said the vicar, in a voice that would have been stern had it not trembled, "are we to understand that you think Mr. Peveril—" "I think nothing so ambitious," she said, "only that a hat of that smallness would never have sat on Mr. Harbottle's head without slipping like a boat that has misjudged the tide, and that someone has put both hat and box beneath our noses with something like a purpose, which is always interesting and sometimes fatal." "Before breakfast," murmured Craddock, "and you've made a sermon of it." He closed the box and gestured to a constable to take it to the vestry for inventory. "We will call at Arbuthnot Hall before luncheon, vicar. Miss Marple, would you like to come?" "Dear me, no," said Miss Marple. "I am not invited to luncheon." "Then," she added, as if afterthought were a feather that had alighted upon her shoulder, "but I think I shall walk in the direction of the Hall, and perhaps get no farther than the village shop where Mrs. Cutler knows everybody's groceries, and therefore their souls." Craddock grinned despite the morning. "Do that," he said, "and pluck me a soul or two for my notebook." Arbuthnot Hall sat beyond the far field, like a ship that had decided to try its fortune on land. Its stone was the honey of former summers, and it carried, despite the weather, a complacent glow. In such houses, Miss Marple always felt there were more rooms than the inhabitants deserved, and somewhere among them a little space that had been used for a purpose entirely private, and therefore unexpectedly dangerous. She had no intention of presenting herself at the great door and putting the household on its guard. She had something better. The tradesman's entrance at the side near the kitchen gardens had grown over with a more homely ivy, and knew the souls of the village the way a confidant knows a face. And the village, through Mrs. Cutler and her brown paper bags, had offered Miss Marple its daily liturgy. It was known already, of course, that Mr. Harbottle, that nasty one from Much Benham as squeezes you like a lemon and keeps the rind, had been found dead in a place people preferred not to speak of, because to speak of a vestry being used for murder was to invite something untidy into Sunday. It was known, too, that a hat had been found, and not his, and now, thanks to Billy the milk boy racing faster than his breath to the shop after leaving Miss Marple, that a hatbox with a gentleman's name was jammed in the lich-gate. Mrs. Cutler, who could pack flour and artlessly unpack character, said with relish, "Mr. Peveril, ma'am, has a way with smiling that makes you want to find a coin for him, and I don't hold with that in a grown man. The nurse at the Hall, Miss Hart, she calls herself, keeps him proper, and that's as well. Mrs. Arbuthnot's hands are not so steady since that fall, and she will have them take tea at peculiar hours. The nurse, she buys candles, and not from me. A sort with a smell about them. Foreign, I shouldn't wonder. Bayberry, Miss Marple said, not as a guess, but as memory. A faint greenish tint, and a clean scent like walking through a hedge. Well, said Mrs. Cutler, surprised into approval. If you say so, ma'am. Miss Marple remembered the smudge on Mr. Harbottle's cuff. It was wax of a sort not used in the church, where beeswax, good and honest, was preferred. Bayberry had a paler drip with a bloom to it, and took a finger mark differently. She saw again, quite clearly, that odd little smear at the edge of the lawyer's cuff like a buttered touch. Mr. Harbottle had been at Arbuthnot Hall last night or very shortly before, perhaps in a room where candles were used despite the advent of electricity. Some people preferred candlelight. It softened hard edges, in faces and in writing. She walked on, not a trespasser but the sort of person who is never anywhere unexpectedly. A gardener, damp and content with his barrow, let her pass with a nod. At the side door, voices in the corridor flared and died as abruptly as matches. Miss Marple did not wish to present herself to the household stage, so she took the path round to the old chapel wing. Arbuthnot Hall, like many houses of its age, retained a little private oratory with a leaded window and a door that stuck in damp weather. The window this morning had its casement unlatched to let out the result of last evening's candles, and beneath the window-sill, as carelessly discarded as a flower's stalk, lay a fragment of candle end, pale and with that faint green bloom Mrs. Cutler had disliked without knowing it. Bayberry. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she looked carefully at the sill. A smear. A small, ugly smear, exactly the colour she had seen on the dead man's cuff. She was not alone in noticing the oratory. The door to the chapel opened suddenly, and out stepped a woman whose face was all straightness. Straight nose, straight gaze, straight mouth. She wore the uniform that allows a woman in a great house to walk anywhere she pleases and be invisible until needed. Grey serge, a watch pinned to the breast, sensible shoes. The nurse, Miss Hart. "You are trespassing," Miss Hart said. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. "And you are Miss Marple." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And we are both correct then." They regarded one another in a silence that had the quality of a clean cloth laid upon a table. Miss Hart's eyes were the colour of fine iron. "If you have business," she said, "it is with Mrs. Arbuthnot, and by appointment through me. If it is not business, then the village may call another day when my patient is less fatigued." "It was only that I wondered," said Miss Marple, producing an innocence that was not at all simple, "if Mrs. Arbuthnot has changed the brand of her candles. So many people do, you know, in damp weather." Miss Hart did not blink. "Mrs. Arbuthnot uses what I buy," she said, "because she trusts me to buy what is proper." "And do you mark hats as well?" Miss Marple inquired, very gently. Something flickered then. Not guilt, not fright, but the small muscle of a person isometric with control. "I mend," Miss Hart said, "when a button requires it or a seam gives." She glanced down as if she could make the hatbox by the Lichgate unhappen merely by refusing to include it in her world. "Mr. Peveril does not carry hatboxes. He is not a clerk, and if someone has written his name on such an article, then I would think it mischief. Men who are not clerks sometimes have initials stitched into their hats," Miss Marple observed, "by women who mend." The nurse's mouth tightened, but her voice remained tidy. "If you want the truth, Miss Marple, Mr. Peveril is no more guilty of violence than you are. He likes ease, and that is a vice, but he does not like blood. He fainted once when I had to lance a boil for the gardener, and he happened to pass the door." "That is a point in his favour," Miss Marple said. "Fainting at a boil is very helpful in murder inquiries. It stops one using a knife." "Inspector Craddock is at the front door," Miss Hart said, looking over Miss Marple's shoulder not because the inspector was there, he was, but because it was a convenient direction in which to suggest an end to the conversation. If you will join him, I will inform Mrs. Arbuthnot that she may be asked to receive you briefly. The last word was a heavy pin. It kept the whole business from shifting about the room. The drawing room had curtains like old gold coins, and the soft dust of more polite centuries sat in the folds of the upholstery. Mrs. Arbuthnot, who had once been fashionable enough to waste time superbly, had gone fragile in a way that made the air around her feel careful. She wore a shawl that had been expensive in the sort of shop that does not mark prices in the window. Her hands, resting upon the shawl, fluttered in microcosm of the leaves outside. A silver bell on the table said more about her than she knew. Beside the hearth stood the man whose name was tied to the hatbox. Hugh Peveril had the sort of brow that looks innocent and the sort of mouth that has had to learn to be. He bowed to Miss Marple as one bows to an old portrait one is told to respect. To Craddock he nodded as, if to a fellow in a club, one has not quite paid for. "You are here about the nonsense in the vestry," Mrs. Arbuthnot said at once, her voice dry as a biscuit that has seen a plate but not a teacup. "I am told it is dreadful, and that I am not to be upset. I do not care to be told such things," Craddock said, with that blunt courtesy he produced in great houses. "A man has died, madam. Mr. Leonard Harbottle." "Of course," she said, bored to the point of elegance. "He was always dying in a manner of speaking. Now I suppose he is finished, and we shall have a clerk instead. And the clerk will be worse." "Harbottle," Peveril said lightly, and then checked himself as Miss Hart, from her place near the door, turned her head a fraction. "I mean, he was to come this morning. He spread his hands. "I had no wish to see him." "Because he had been advising your guardian to revise her will," Craddock put in without malice, as one states the weather. "Inspector," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, sharply, "you will not distress me with vulgarities. My will is my affair." "It is when you are alive," Miss Marple said so sweetly that the edge of it only landed a moment later, and then landed very neatly indeed. "Afterwards it becomes everybody's." Peveril laughed, and then looked unhappy about having laughed. "Miss Marple shoots," he said. "I had forgotten." "I never forget anything," said Miss Marple. "It is too much trouble to sort what is important and what is not. And so, I keep all of it. You are collecting hats now, are you?" he asked, attempting whimsy with a face that had not shaved very well. "Hats," Miss Marple said gravely, "and the places they come from." She indicated the luggage label, which Craddock had brought from the box and set upon the table to dry like a wounded moth. "You travelled on the Pullman last night?" "No," Peveril said. "I borrowed a motor car from Mr. Linton, and then found the storm too much for the old thing, so I turned back." "Ask him," Craddock said. "We shall." And Miss Marple, following the edge of the label with her eye, noticed two things that were not showy but were true. The pencil had been pressed with a hand that never learnt to write in the schoolroom. The downstrokes were heavy, and the tails untidy. And the loop of the G in Hugh had been formed high and open, a habit taught by some governesses, and nearly always retained by women, less so by men. The label's string bore a pinch mark at one end where someone had used their teeth in haste. Miss Marple's mouth made a small, polite curve of sympathy for the teeth. "Miss Hart," she said, turning with apparent irrelevance, "do you use bayberry candles at night in the oratory?" "I use what I consider suitable for Mrs. Arbuthnot," the nurse said, and if the line had not been quite so perfectly straight, one might have suspected it of being an answer. "And Mr. Harbottle," Miss Marple went on gently, "called last evening?" "I saw no one," Mrs. Arbuthnot said. "I was indisposed by the weather. Weather makes a different person of me." "Then you did not sign anything," Miss Marple said, watching the other woman's hands as one watches moths, not to catch them but to know where they might settle. I sign what my lawyer tells me to sign, Mrs. Arbuthnot said tartly, and the little flutter became a tremor, as if the strings on a puppet had been pulled too quickly. Craddock set down his pencil. You were expecting Mr. Harbottle and he did not come, he said. He is found dead in a church vestry, beside a hat that is not his, and then the hat is obligingly boxed and labelled with your ward's name. That is a great many helpful things arranged by a person we have not yet met. Hugh Peveril coloured. It was not the blush of innocence. It was the flush of irritation made self-conscious. Inspector, he said, if I had killed your Harbottle, I would not have stayed awake to find a box and write my own name upon it, however poor my understanding of criminality. You might have written another name, Craddock agreed. That would have been cleverer. Please, said Miss Hart with a steel the drawing-room had not expected of her. Mrs. Arbuthnot must be kept calm. If you will keep the rest of your cleverness for the hallway, we shall be obliged. She looked at Miss Marple then, and this time there was something like dismay in the iron of her eyes. And you, madam, pray do not stir the tea while it is hot. Miss Marple blinked. My dear, she said, tea cools whether one stirs it or not. That is what makes it so hopeless and so comforting. It is the most English thing we possess. They were politely shown to the door by a footman who had been somebody's son and now was somebody's glove. In the corridor, Craddock said low, You noticed? Many things, Miss Marple returned. The nurse, he said, protective of Peveril, more than her office requires. Not protective, Miss Marple murmured. Preventative? It is not the same thing. Of what? Of him, said Miss Marple, saying something true by accident. She glanced through the long window and saw, across the lawn, the oratory's small leaded pane and the pale smear upon the sill. Mr. Harbottle was in that room last night. Because of the wax? Yes. I do wish people would choose a single sort of candle. It would make life tidier, but so dull. Craddock chuckled once and then stopped. His cuff, he said. You are right. We only need to prove it. You will not, Miss Marple said, serenely. Not yet, but you might ask Mrs. Cutler about who buys candles and on whose account. She set her head to one side, listening to her own scrap basket of the village. And you might consider whether a hat labelled with a gentleman's name and stitched by feminine hands has not been used to take our noses for a walk. For notice, Inspector, the size. Mr. Peveril has a hat's worth of hair still. He would never have worn so small a thing unless he intended it to be noticed, and clever men rarely intend such a crude notice. They parted at the gate with a promise to meet at the vestry after luncheon, for Craddock wanted to set his constable to guard it properly now that someone had proved inclined to visit by night. Miss Marple walked home and did not do as other old ladies might have done, which is to sit down and be comforted by the fire. Instead, she fetched from her sideboard a little tin, in which she kept, not biscuits, but bits of string and paper clips, and the sort of pins that come with new shirts and have sharp characters. She selected a pin and put it in her sleeve. Then she fetched another tin from a deeper drawer. This one contained a handful of old luggage labels whose strings had broken. She took out two and laid them side by side, studying the loop of the G and the thickness of the strokes and the way one might hold a pencil when one's hand had been trained by a governess or by a schoolmaster. The loops of women are different. They are taught to think of prettiness. She arrived at the vestry to find it solemn with the small noises of officialdom. A constable she did not know looked at her as one looks at a kitten, and then pretends one has not noticed it is in the kitchen at all. Craddock, frowning over the vestry table, acknowledged her with a nod. The brown hat sat where the box had deposited it, a damp and sullen thing. The envelope that had lain unopened the night before was gone. Craddock's jaw had the granite look of men who are discovering their pockets empty. I should have had it away last night, he said, castigating himself with a parsimony Miss Marple could almost admire. The doctor delayed me. He gestured to the table. But there is this. There was, propped with care upon a blotter, a small rectangle of pasteboard whose edges had curled as if trying to make themselves graceful, despite indignity. The Queen of Hearts. The same card Miss Marple had seen and not advertised. Only now it had been placed upright and, deliberate and on its face just beneath the Queen's throat, a brownish stain no rain had made. A message, Craddock said, or the sort of mischief that thinks itself clever. I will send it to be examined for... He stopped, aware of saying too much in the presence of a person who did not care for laboratories because she possessed her own. Miss Marple moved to the hat. "May I?" she asked, and when he nodded she lifted it with hands that had turned 1,000 hems and hidden 1,000 small, devices where they would not be found by anyone but another woman. She ran a finger beneath the sweat band, very gently, and felt, just where hats sometimes hold the memory of a brow, the edge of something that no gentleman would have placed there. She used the little shirt pin from her sleeve to tease it loose. It came away folded twice, a narrow strip, papery and stiff, protected somewhat by the band from the worst wetting. She laid it flat in her palm and the room seemed for a moment to lean in with her. The writing was a careful legal hand. Mr. Harbottle's she judged at once by the lower loop of the F which fancied itself a swan and by the way he crossed his T, not at all when the word was possessive and angrily when it was not. The fragment was from the bottom of a page. Only 3 lines were legible, but they were quite enough. Revoking the disposition in favour of Hugh Peveril. To be opened in the vestry with 2 witnesses present. Sealed by me this night. Craddock swore, which he rarely allowed himself. Then he said with a steadiness that had effort in it, "Someone removed the envelope and left us this instead, to look one way and not the other." Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her mind had turned, and the click was audible only to her. The envelope had been left with its injunction, to be read in the presence of witnesses. That was to ensure that contents could not be put aside by the very person who would benefit. Mr. Harbottle had come to the hall last evening. In some small private room lit by Bayberry candles, he had written a paper that took from Hugh Peveril what had once been promised. He had brought that paper to the vestry, meaning to open it when the churchwardens or the vicar were at hand to bind the business up with propriety. He had been prevented. After his death, someone had entered this room and thought to remove danger, taking the envelope and leaving, as decoys and crumbs, a hat in a hatbox and a playing card, like a stage. Property, someone tidy, someone who used nurses' knots, someone who kept powder in a drawer for the use of an elderly lady and did not care for men who smiled at coins. Miss Marple's eyes went to the fragment again. The handwriting had a new flaw. The P of Peveril had an extra small serif at the foot, a tiny tick to the right. Mr. Harbottle did not make it so in his letters that had passed across the vicar's desk on parish business. But he might have done just so if he were writing with a pen he disliked, or if someone had traced over his letters with a heavier hand. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, as though the room might bruise if she raised her voice, "would you be so good as to send a man at once to Arbuthnot Hall and ask, kindly, very kindly, that Miss Hart remain in the drawing-room with Mrs. Arbuthnot until you arrive, and another to fetch Mr. Linton and his motor-car, and another to inquire of Mrs. Cutler whether Miss Hart buys her candles at the chemist in Much Benham or has them down from London by post." Craddock did not ask why. He did not need to. "And you, Miss Marple?" "I," she said with a little absent smile that belonged to no one. "I'm going to find out how many Queens of Hearts there are in St. Mary Mead." She looked at the card on the blotter and then passed it at the hat, which seemed now less a hat than a container for other people's neatness. "It is a vulgar symbol for love and a better one for gambling. Mr. Harbottle did not gamble with cards. He gambled with people. Someone has dealt us a queen because they think we will adore the picture. Will we? Craddock asked. No, said Miss Marple kindly. We will adore the printing. She pointed, with one small forefinger, to the lower corner of the card where the maker's mark had been stamped in weed-thin capitals. Temple Press, Series C, she read. Mrs. Price Ridley's bridge set is Series B. Mrs. Banbury's is Series A, because Mr. Banbury thinks only foreign cards are respectable. There is only one Series C in the village, and it sits in the drawer of the table in Arbuthnot Hall's little morning room, for Mrs. Arbuthnot plays patience after luncheon because it makes her feel she has decided something important without consequence. Craddock stared. Then he said slowly, "And the hatbox?" Miss Marple lifted her eyes. They were very bright. "The hatbox," she said, "does not exist. It is a fiction. Oh, the object is there, to be sure, with its twine and its labels and its damp. But it has been created the way stories are created, by a person who cannot resist arranging the scene so prettily that they forget the audience in this village is not quite the audience they imagine. A nurse's knot, a governess's loop on a G, a Bayberry smear, a powder that does not belong to a man's hat. These are not the things a rough killer leaves behind. They are the things a tidy woman tidies after herself. And tidying always reveals more than it conceals. The church clock struck the quarter, very dignified about it. Footsteps went through the nave as someone's grief arrived to kneel, unaware of the sharpened air in the vestry. Outside, the puddles reflected sky enough to pretend they were windows. Miss Marple folded the fragment again and tucked it beneath the sweatband where it had come from, for the time being. Then she looked at Inspector Craddock with a mildness that did not deceive him, and said, "The next chapter will be the post. If there was a letter, Inspector, that should have arrived last night and did not, then we must ask where it delayed itself and who profited by its delay. For now, shall we go and see which of the candles at Arbuthnot Hall drips like a cuff?" Before he could answer, the constable at the church door called, anxious, to say a messenger had come from the hall, white-faced and insistent. The young footman stood there with rain in his eyelashes and said in a voice that tried to be butler-like and failed, "Beg pardon, sir. The nurse says Mrs. Arbuthnot has had a shock." "It's the will, sir. The will has been opened and there's a page missing." Miss Marple looked at the hat, at the card, at the damp, clean line on the vestry floor where the box had sat and been set down by careful hands, and felt the little clock in her head give 2 quick ticks. The missing page would be the page whose bottom lay tucked warm and secret beneath the hatband. Someone would be hunting for it now in all the tidy places. Someone who could not, if begged, stop tidying the truth. "Come," she said to Craddock, and the word was as neat and inexorable as a pin pushed home. Chapter 3. A letter that arrived. Too late. The morning had broken with a peculiar stillness, the kind that makes the air feel weighted with expectation, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The storm of the previous day had left the roads slick with mud and the hedgerows dripping. By mid-morning, the postman trudged up the lane towards St. Mary Mead. His sack dampened, his boots caked. He stopped at Miss Marple's cottage, tipping his cap in the polite manner he had cultivated since boyhood. "Strange thing this morning, ma'am," he said, his breath fogging faintly in the chill. "Got a letter for the vicarage, but it's been mis-sorted. Sat in the sorting office overnight when it should have gone yesterday. Funny thing is, it's marked urgent." Miss Marple took it gently, her blue eyes narrowing. The envelope was cream, thick, the kind solicitors use when they wish to signify importance. The script upon it was unmistakably Leonard Harbottle's sharp, crabbed hand. Her heart gave a small, precise flutter. Harbottle, dead now upon the vestry floor, had still been at work yesterday, it seemed. She turned the envelope over. The seal was intact, bearing the imprint of Harbottle's signet ring. The address was neat. To the Reverend Cyril Goodfellow, St Mary Mead Vicarage, to be delivered by hand and at once. The postman, shifting uncomfortably, added, "It weren't our fault, ma'am. Came in late to the office and got put in the wrong tray. We only just found it." He looked, relieved when Miss Marple smiled kindly and promised she would herself deliver it to the vicar straight away. Yet her mind was not at ease. In mysteries, as in gardens, timing was everything. A rose that blooms too late may be as telling as a weed that appears unbidden. She found the vicar in his study, pale and harassed, his cassock askew. The man had aged in the last 24 hours, his eyes darting as though the walls themselves might accuse him. He stared at the envelope as though it were a ghost risen. "From Harbottle," he muttered, his hand trembling as he broke the seal. The letter within was short, written in that spiky legal script with phrases underlined twice. As he read, the blood drained from his face. Miss Marple, who had long since mastered the art of standing quietly until her presence was forgotten, waited. At last he slumped into his chair, the letter slipping onto the desk. She picked it up with delicate fingers. The words were stark. "Reverend Goodfellow, as agreed. I shall attend upon you this evening to deposit the codicil, revoking the Arbuthnot disposition in favour of Hugh Peveril. This must be executed with your witness, as the lady's health prevents her signing in proper stead. I enclose a note of instructions. You will appreciate the urgency. There is danger of interference if this is delayed. Yours, L. Harbottle." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on one phrase, danger of interference. The solicitor had known he was treading dangerous ground. That explained his insistence on witnesses, on formality. And yet, he had never lived to deposit the codicil. His body lay in the vestry, the envelope that should have secured the matter gone. Someone had been very swift indeed to silence him before the letter could reach its destination. The vicar moaned softly. I was at home all the evening, Miss Marple. Had this come yesterday, why, I might have—" He broke off, his hands twisting together in misery. Miss Marple laid the letter down. "Mr. Goodfellow, there is no good in reproach. The post was delayed, and perhaps Mr. Harbottle was already doomed by the time he put pen to paper. But what is plain is that he feared interference. He expected opposition. And from whom, do you suppose?" The vicar's lips trembled. "From Hugh, naturally. He stands to lose everything." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Do people, when they know they are to lose, act so crudely as to stamp their initials in a hat and thrust it under our noses? That, to me, feels like the hand of someone else, someone who wishes us to look where we ought not." Before the vicar could answer, a sharp knock rattled the study door. Inspector Craddock entered, his greatcoat still dotted with mist. He greeted Miss Marple with a brief nod, his eyes alighting on the letter. She handed it to him without a word. He read quickly, his brows lifting. "Late in the post," he muttered. "That explains much. If the codicil was prepared yesterday evening, and Harbottle came today, the vestry intending to deposit it with the vicar, then whoever killed him must have known of it." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but every syllable carried weight. "Or suspected. A man like Mr. Harbottle did not keep his dealings as private as he believed. Gossip travels faster than the post." Craddock pocketed the letter. "I'll have to speak again with Peveril. He'll deny, of course, but the fact remains. He's the one whose name is in that codicil." He turned to the vicar. "You'll need to tell me, sir, whether Harbottle confided in you before." But the vicar seemed incapable of coherent reply. His hands fumbled among his papers, his forehead beaded. Miss Marple noted it, but said nothing. Fear, in her experience, often meant more than guilt. It meant knowledge. That afternoon, Craddock called at Arbuthnot Hall again, and Miss Marple, by some quiet insistence, accompanied him. The great house seemed gloomier now, the very curtains weighed down by secrecy. Hugh Peveril lounged in the morning room, his eyes shadowed but his manner flippant. He looked at the inspector and Miss Marple with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. You come again so soon. You'll make the servants gossip and Nurse Hart will scold me like a schoolboy. Craddock wasted no time. He laid the letter upon the table. Mr. Harbottle wrote this yesterday. He intended to lodge a codicil cancelling your inheritance. He warned of interference. The smile faltered. Hugh reached for the letter, but Craddock's hand came down flat. Hugh's fingers curled back. If that is true, he said softly, then Harbottle has played his last trick. He's been threatening me for weeks, always muttering about duty, about debts. I told him I'd not be blackmailed into behaving like a penitent. If he's dead, I can't say I'm sorry, but I didn't kill him. Miss Marple spoke then, her voice as mild as if she were discussing tea cakes. Blackmail, Mr. Peveril. That is an ugly word. And yet your tone suggests it was not only inheritance he held over you. His eyes flickered. He knew things, old things, before the war. Trivial, but dressed up they could look dark. He enjoyed power. He used it like a whip. Nurse Hart entered at that moment, a tray in her hands. Her grey uniform was impeccable, her expression composed, but her eyes rested on Hugh with an odd mixture of disdain and protectiveness. Tea, she said. If we are to continue this inquisition, at least fortify yourselves. As she set down the tray, Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. On the napkin beneath the teapot was a small brown smear, faint but distinct, the colour of sealing wax. And not the deep beeswax red one expected, but a lighter, foreign shade. She remembered the smudge on Harbottle's cuff, the bayberry candle wax near the oratory. Too many smudges to be coincidence. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the nurse. You have a steady hand, Miss Hart. That is valuable in both nursing and other duties. The nurse met her gaze, calmly. I do what is required. Nothing more, nothing less. Craddock turned back to Hugh. Where were you last night, after you abandoned Mr. Linton's car? In the billiards room, Hugh said promptly. Alone, I admit, which is unlucky for me. Unlucky indeed, Craddock said. Miss Marple set down her cup. The unlucky are often so only because they have made enemies. Mr. Harbottle had many. We must ask ourselves, who profits most from his silence? At that moment, a maid slipped into the room, nervous and twisting her apron. Beg pardon, sir, ma'am? But the afternoon post has come, and there's a letter for you, Miss Marple. From Much Benham. Miss Marple took it, her fingers careful on the thin paper. She broke the seal and read silently. Her eyes sharpened. The letter was from a junior clerk at Harbottle's firm, addressed hastily and with apologies. It stated that Mr. Harbottle had sent, the day before his death, a duplicate copy of the codicil to the firm's safe, with instructions it be held until signed in the vicar's presence. But the envelope had been intercepted, opened, resealed, and returned to the office by hand this very morning, delivered by a lady claiming to be acting for the Arbuthnot household. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly, her face composed. She turned to Craddock. You see, Inspector, there was not one letter delayed, but two. One by post, the other by interference. And whoever brought back that second envelope did so after Harbottle was dead. A lady, they say. The room went very still. Nurse Hart's hands did not tremble, but her jaw tightened. Hugh Peveril shifted uneasily. Mrs. Arbuthnot, from her seat by the fire, raised her fragile voice. I sign what my lawyer tells me to sign. If something has been stolen, it is none of my doing. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the wax-stained napkin, on the nurse's controlled stillness, on Hugh's restless smile. Then she said softly, The question, Inspector, is not only who killed Leonard Harbottle, but who ensured that his letter, his true letter, arrived just too late, and I fear we may find the answer closer to this house than we like. The silence that followed was broken by the striking of the hall clock, each chime heavy as a blow. And in that silence Miss Marple knew that the codicil, the hat, the letter, delayed, all were threads leading to one careful, clever hand. As she rose to leave, the maid who had brought the post spoke timidly. "Oh, Miss Marple, I near forgot. There was something else in the bag. Slipped in with the letter. Looks like a playing card. I thought it queer." She handed over a damp, curled Queen of Hearts. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, her voice grave. "Another queen. From another deck. And this one, Inspector, is marked with powder." The chapter closed on the hush of realization. Someone in Arbuthnot Hall was planting their symbols with precision. And Miss Marple, her mind sharper than any blade, knew that the next revelation would not be long in coming. Chapter 4. The Alibi. No one believed. The storm had not yet fully spent itself when Inspector Craddock arrived at the vicarage again, his boots slick with mud, his eyes shadowed by a night without rest. The lamp in the study cast a pale circle upon the desk where the letter from Harbottle still lay open, a reminder of promises unkept and instructions that had arrived too late to save him. The vicar sat stiffly, his hands folded as though in prayer, but the moisture glistening on his forehead betrayed the fact that prayers had given him no peace. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner with her knitting, looked up as Craddock entered. "Well, it seems everyone has an alibi, and none of them worth a halfpenny," Craddock said grimly, throwing his hat onto the chair. "Mr. Peveril claims he spent the stormy night alone in the billiards room, which is as good as saying nothing. Nurse Hart insists she never left Mrs. Arbuthnot's side after tea, yet the footman swears he saw her cross the hall near midnight. And as for Linton, he says his motor car failed him, and he spent the evening mired in the lane, which not a soul can confirm. Everyone has an alibi, Miss Marple, yet not one to be believed." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Yes, that is often the way of it. The guilty produce alibis too strong, too rehearsed, and the innocent ones falter out of nerves and so appear untrustworthy. The truth is rarely where it pretends to be." Craddock leaned against the mantelpiece, staring into the fire. "And then there's the matter of that second letter, the one returned to Harbottle's office this morning. A lady delivered it, so the clerk said. A lady with a veil, and she gave no name. Who in Arbuthnot Hall would dare such a thing?" The vicar stirred uneasily. "Surely not Mrs. Arbuthnot herself. She is too frail. And Nurse Hart, why, she is most correct. She would never step into so questionable a role." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were thoughtful. "A nurse's duty is to appear correct. It is what makes her invisible when she wishes to be." That afternoon, Craddock arranged to interview the principal suspects once more, this time in the library at Arbuthnot Hall. Miss Marple accompanied him, though she took her usual place in the shadows of the room, where her quiet presence was overlooked until it was too late. The library smelled of damp wool and pipe smoke, though no pipe had been smoked there in years. Rain tapped impatiently against the tall windows. Hugh Peveril was brought in first, his handsome face drawn but his eyes carrying that same glint of defiance. "You've dragged me in again, Inspector. Very well. I'll repeat myself until the walls believe me if you won't." "Then do so," Craddock said sharply. "You claim you spent the night of Harbottle's death alone in the billiards room. Who saw you there?" "No one, but neither did anyone see me anywhere else, which ought to prove my point. I'm not fool enough to strangle a solicitor in a church and then wander about boasting of it." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "No one saw you, Mr. Peveril, but did anyone hear you?" Hugh glanced at her, startled. "Hear me?" "Billiard balls," she said softly. "They have a most particular sound when struck. A click that carries further than one expects, especially in an old house where hallways echo. Did no servant mention hearing such a sound?" He hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. "Perhaps," he muttered. "One of the maids might." Have. I can't recall. Convenient, Craddock said dryly. And yet, not convincing. You had everything to lose from Harbottle's codicil. Hugh flushed. If I had killed him, Inspector, do you think I'd have been fool enough to leave my initials in a hat and plant it in the vestry? Or wedge a box in the lich gate with my name scrawled upon it? I'm not so stupid as that. Craddock regarded him coldly. Some murderers are. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Hugh as he was dismissed. There was arrogance in him, but also a sort of helplessness, like a boy caught in a trick that had spiraled out of his grasp. He was clever enough to scheme, but not clever enough to scheme well. Nurse Hart entered next. Her grey uniform was immaculate, her hands folded before her. She looked every inch the professional woman, calm, practical, without vanity. Yet Miss Marple noticed the faintest scent of bayberry that lingered when she moved, a scent not easily forgotten once one had connected it to the smudge of wax on Harbottle's cuff. You claim to have been with Mrs. Arbuthnot all evening, Craddock asked. I do. She is not well. I do not leave her. Yet the footman swears he saw you cross the hall near midnight. The nurse's lips tightened. He is mistaken. I fetched a glass of water from the pantry at 10:30. That may be what he recalls. Was Mrs. Arbuthnot awake at that time? She was drowsing, sir. I left her for no more than a minute. Certainly not long enough to run to the church and back, if that is what you imply. Miss Marple's voice came softly from the shadows. A minute is long enough, Miss Hart, if the thing to be done is not the murder itself but the removal of a paper. The nurse turned her head sharply, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. For one fleeting instant the calm mask slipped and something flinty showed beneath. Then it was gone. I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. I am not the one with debts and vices to conceal. She left the room with her head high. Craddock exhaled. She lies, he said, but about what I cannot yet pin down. Finally Mr. Linton was ushered in. A stout man with a ruddy complexion, he looked weary of the whole affair. I told you before, Inspector, my motor car gave out on the lane to Much Benham. Wretched machine. I spent the night trying to start it, and finally abandoned it in disgust. Alone? Craddock asked. Yes, there was no one about. Yet, when my constable went this morning to examine the lane, he found no sign of a motor car stuck in mud. Not a wheel mark, not a footprint. Curious, isn't it? Linton flushed. The rain washed them away, of course. Perhaps. Or perhaps you were never there at all. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes on Linton's hands. You smoke cigars, do you not, Mr. Linton? Yes. And what of it? There is an ash caught in the cuff of your coat. A very fine grey ash. Not from a cigar, but from a candle wick. Bayberry again, I think. A candle used in haste, perhaps, when one dared not. Switch on a lamp. Linton's eyes narrowed. You have a sharp tongue for a gentlewoman, Miss Marple. Be careful where you wag it. But she only smiled mildly. I have no tongue, Mr. Linton, only eyes. When he had gone, the library was quiet save for the ticking of the clock. Craddock rubbed his temples. 3 alibis, and not a soul believes any of them. Each could be the murderer. Each could be lying for reasons not yet clear. Miss Marple folded her knitting. We must remember, Inspector, that lies are not always to conceal murder. Sometimes they are told to conceal something quite different, something smaller perhaps, but dangerous if revealed. The task is to discern which lie is which. Craddock glanced at her. And how do you propose to do that? By listening, she said simply. People reveal themselves most when they try not to. Nurse Hart revealed she is afraid of paper more than blood. Mr. Linton fears exposure of some candlelit errand more than the gallows. And Mr. Peveril, well, he fears being thought a fool. The rain lashed harder against the windows, as though the storm itself were listening. It was late that night, after Craddock had gone, when Miss Marple sat in her parlour with the letter once more before her. She smoothed the page, noting again Harbottle's hurried hand. Then her eyes caught on something she had missed before. The ink blot in the margin, shaped oddly like a thumbprint. Not Harbottle's. His hand had always been neat, controlled. This was the mark of someone who had taken the letter, folded it again with damp fingers, and replaced it. Proof of tampering. Proof that the codicil had been interfered with before it ever reached the vicar. The knock at her door startled her. She rose, candle in hand, and opened it to find the maid from Arbuthnot Hall, shivering in the rain. "Please, Miss Marple," the girl whispered. "I didn't know where else to go. They told me to keep quiet, but I can't. I saw Mr. Linton in the chapel wing last night, near the oratory. He had a paper in his hand. And he burned it." Miss Marple drew the girl in, her expression grave. The flames from the hearth crackled, casting tall shadows on the walls. So that was it, then. One of the missing papers had gone into fire. But which? She comforted the girl, sent her safely home, then sat long into the night, knitting forgotten in her lap. The storm outside ebbed at last, leaving the village drenched in silence. And Miss Marple, staring into the embers, knew that tomorrow would bring revelation, either of guilt or of yet another layer of lies. The clue lay not only in who lied, but in why their alibi was constructed so poorly. And in that question she felt waited the next step toward the truth. As she rose to douse the lamp, her eye fell upon a scrap of paper slipped beneath her door, sodden with rain. She picked it up and read the single sentence scrawled there. "The codicil is not destroyed. It is hidden in the vestry floor." Her breath caught. Another hand in the game, another secret player. Someone wanted her to know, but why? The chapter ended on that silent question, the paper trembling in her hand. Chapter 5. The Will That Vanished Overnight. The rain had ceased at last, leaving the village swathed in a damp fog that clung to hedges and gravestones like a shroud. At Arbuthnot Hall, the house was restless in its silence, as though every creak of the oak beams carried a whisper of accusation. It was just past dawn when the first cry came, a shrill, panicked wail from the maid who had gone to tidy the library. Her voice echoed down the long corridor until it reached the ears of every inhabitant, like the tolling of a bell before a funeral. Inspector Craddock was already in the house, having spent the night in a hastily arranged room nearby. He arrived at the library within moments, his coat unbuttoned, his expression grim. The rest of the household followed in a disordered procession. Hugh Peveril, pale and irritated, Nurse Hart, sharp-eyed and composed, Mrs. Arbuthnot, frail in her shawl, carried along as if borne on the air of her own indignation. And, quietly at the rear, Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible grey cloak, her gaze calm and penetrating. The library was in disarray. Papers had been swept from the great mahogany desk as though by a hurried hand. The drawer in which Harbottle had placed his documents only yesterday afternoon hung open, its contents scattered. And the heavy leather folder that had contained Mrs. Arbuthnot's will, signed, witnessed, and sealed, was gone. "It's vanished," the maid sobbed, wringing her hands. "I was only gone an hour, sir. I swear it. I left it neat as ever last night." Craddock muttered a curse under his breath. The will. Stolen. He glanced at the others. "None of you left your rooms after retiring?" Peveril laughed bitterly. "We are to answer like schoolboys, I suppose. Very well. I did not. Though no one will believe me, of course." Mrs. Arbuthnot raised a trembling hand. "My will? Gone? This is insupportable. I am an old woman, Inspector, not to be treated like a pawn in the games of greedy men." "Or greedy women," Nurse Hart said softly, her eyes glinting. The remark was not lost on Miss Marple, who had been studying the desk with her customary, unobtrusive care. She bent and picked up a fragment from the carpet, a narrow strip of paper torn as if by accident when the drawer was wrenched. She examined it in the light of the window where the fog curled pale against the glass. The fragment bore a faint smudge of blue-black ink in Harbottle's distinctive hand, and the half-word, bequeath. "Not all of it has gone," she said gently, handing the slip to Craddock. "The thief was hurried, and a hurried hand tears what it means to take whole." Craddock frowned. "So at least we know the thief had no time for forgery. The document itself was their aim, not a copy." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And one must ask, why remove the entire will? If the codicil was the danger, then destroying that alone would suffice. To vanish the whole document suggests something different. That what was written in the body of the will itself frightened someone very much indeed." Her eyes moved across the room, lingering briefly on Hugh, whose lips pressed into a tight line, then on Nurse Hart, whose stillness was almost too exact, like a mask fixed in place. The investigation began at once. Craddock ordered the doors locked, the staff gathered, the rooms searched. Miss Marple, with her small, careful steps, moved instead to the window. The sill bore a faint smear, a trace of mud, recently dried. She touched it with her gloved finger and noted the thin scrape of grit. Someone had leaned here, perhaps set something down upon the ledge before slipping into the foggy garden below. "Inspector," she said, "you will want to see the footprints in the grass beneath this window." Outside, sure enough, the lawn bore the mark of a hasty descent, a pair of prints pressed deep where the earth was soft from the storm. They led not to the drive, but toward the side garden, where rose bushes huddled against the wall. Craddock bent low, his jaw tightening. "Shoes with a narrow sole, not a man's boots." "Not necessarily," Miss Marple corrected softly. "Some men wear narrower shoes these days, but the stride is short, more likely a woman's." The prints vanished into the gravel beyond, too muddled to trace further. Back inside, Craddock turned to the assembled household. "Until the will is found, no one leaves the house. Someone here has taken it." Peveril flung up his hands. "Of course you'll look to me. You always do. And why not? Everyone knows I stand to gain or lose, but if I had it, I'd hardly have been fool enough to steal it overnight, when suspicion was sharpest. You may think me reckless, Inspector, but not an idiot." "Reckless men," Miss Marple murmured, "are very often the ones who overestimate their cleverness." He gave her a sharp glance but said nothing. Nurse Hart spoke then, her voice measured. "Inspector, it is a grave error to keep us penned here like criminals. Mrs. Arbuthnot is unwell. She must rest." "Rest?" Mrs. Arbuthnot snapped suddenly, her fragile composure cracking. "Rest while jackals tear apart my affairs? No, Inspector. I will not rest until I know who dares to meddle with my will." Her outburst startled even Hugh, who looked away uneasily. Miss Marple, however, observed her keenly. There was pride there, and fear too, not merely of death but of betrayal. The will had been her weapon as much as her legacy. As the day wore on, Craddock searched the rooms, questioned each servant, and examined every scrap of paper in the house. Nothing. The will had vanished as if spirited away. Yet Miss Marple, quietly piecing her observations, began to form her own conclusion. That evening she sat by the fire with her knitting once more. The household had retreated into uneasy silence. Hugh drank too quickly in the drawing-room. Nurse Hart hovered over Mrs. Arbuthnot with a vigilance that seemed more possession than care. Linton had retreated to his chamber, claiming fatigue. Only Miss Marple and Craddock lingered in the library, staring at the empty drawer. "You think it was done from inside," Craddock said, rubbing his chin. "Not a stranger slipping in the night?" "Oh, certainly from inside," Miss Marple replied. "Strangers rarely know the precise drawer to open, and strangers do not tear a fragment and leave it upon the carpet. That was the work of someone who feared discovery at any moment. Craddock sighed. Then which of them? The nurse, with her endless composure? The ward, with his debts? Or Mrs. Arbuthnot herself? Too frail to rise, but perhaps not too frail to plot. Miss Marple looked at the fire, her needles glinting in the light. There is one small thing, Inspector, that troubles me. When a will vanishes, it is rarely because of the fortunes it grants, but because of what it reveals. Secrets have a way of being written into such documents. Not only who gains, but who loses. And sometimes that is more dangerous. Still, their conversation was interrupted by the sudden entrance of the maid again, breathless. "Please, sir, the gardener has found something, by the well in the side garden." They hurried out into the damp night, lanterns bobbing through the fog. The gardener stood by the stone well, his cap in his hands, his eyes wide. At his feet lay a bundle wrapped hastily in oilcloth. Craddock bent and unwrapped it. Inside was the missing leather folder, soaked but intact. Yet when they opened it, there, relief turned to dismay. The pages within were blank, sheets of common foolscap cut and stacked to mimic the thickness of the will. The document itself was gone. "Switched," Craddock growled. "Someone planted this to mislead us." Miss Marple touched the oilcloth thoughtfully. "But not merely to mislead, Inspector. To taunt. Whoever took the will wishes us to know it is in their hands, safe from discovery. This is not concealment. It is a declaration." Craddock swore again, more softly this time. "And what do you make of it, Miss Marple?" She looked down into the dark mouth of the well where water glimmered faintly far below. "That, Inspector, is no mere theft. It is a message, and, if I am not mistaken, the thief has told us exactly who they are." Craddock frowned. "And who is that?" But Miss Marple did not answer. She bent to pick up another scrap that had been caught beneath the twine of the oilcloth, a shred of wax, pale green, smelling faintly of bayberry. She held it up. Between finger and thumb, her eyes very bright. "A message, Inspector," she repeated softly, "and one that tells us more than the thief intended. The will has vanished, but the wax remains." The fog closed around them heavy and secretive, as though the night itself had drawn nearer to hear what was said next. Miss Marple slipped the wax into her reticule, her thoughts already running far ahead. Somewhere in Arbuthnot Hall, someone had miscalculated, and she meant to see precisely where that miscalculation would lead. The chapter ended with the sound of water dripping into the depths of the well, echoing like the tolling of a hidden truth waiting to rise. Chapter 6. The Suspect Who Left Without Leaving. At first bell, the churchyard lay the colour of old pewter, the fog drawn low over the graves, as if the dead had put up their blankets against a chill. Miss Marple stood with Inspector Craddock in the vestry, each of them holding a corner of the small worn rug before the aumbry as though it were a stretcher. "There," Miss Marple said very softly, for the stone beneath had a hairline crack she had once dusted with her handkerchief in idle cleanliness, while waiting for christening mothers. A woman's fidget, she had often been told, was a nuisance. She had never found it so. Craddock set his shoulder to the flag, and it lifted with a damp sigh, exhaling the earth's breath and something fainter. A ghost of candle smoke, bayberry mild. The cavity beneath was no larger than a hatbox. There were no papers, the anonymous note that had summoned them. The codicil is not destroyed. It is hidden in the vestry floor, had been truthful yesterday, and a lie by dawn. Only two things lay in the hollow. A tiny shaving of pale green wax flattened to a crescent by the weight of something set upon it, and the corner of a playing card's back, blue and stippled, torn clean across the maker's mark so that only play, pra, C remained. Craddock swore under his breath. "Temple Press, Series C," Miss Marple finished for him, not triumphantly but like a name remembered in church mid-hymn. "Our Queen's family." She touched the wax with a gloved finger. "Lifted in. the night by someone who had no business abroad, and, if I may say so, no need of lamps. Craddock slid the stone back with care and set the rug straight, as if the small ceremony might appease the insult done to the place. Someone in the hall, he said. No stranger would know the vestry floor the way a cat knows a step. He straightened. And a woman, if we count this obsession with candles and cards and hatboxes, though a woman can kill as cleanly as a man when the object is paper. Miss Marple did not argue. She saw the small damp marks their boots had made upon the flagstones, and beside them the faintest memory of last night's boots, thin and neat, the heels speaking softly in the wet as they went. Whoever came had a key, she murmured, or did not need one. The vicar says he locked the church, Craddock said. The vicar says many things, Miss Marple returned, and smiled kindly, for she liked Mr. Goodfellow the way a hen likes a fidgety chick and worries for its neck. The post office at St. Mary Mead smelled that morning of string and gum and the confidence of a woman who knows the contents of the village better than its vicar. Miss Finch, spare and bright-eyed behind the little wicket, counted money with the morality of a metronome. Your inspector asked about the bus, Miss Marple. Oh, I can tell you more than the bus. The river was up last night, and the culvert at Low Meadow went out at 8:15. Charlie Hodge from the farm came in shouting. So the 9:00 Pullman didn't run on the branch. They filled in with the later ordinary, so the 9:25 was held, and no carriage direct to Much Benham till near 11. The veiled lady Mr. Craddock fished out of the solicitor's clerk's memory could not have gone by Pullman what with no Pullman to go by. If a lady went at all, she went by her legs or by a gentleman's kindness. Miss Marple's eyes travelled along the wall where the timetable hung with a sanctity greater than a litany. And the 10:40 parcel run? She asked innocently. Cancelled, Miss Finch said with relish. And the bridge guards saw no one cross the footway once they'd posted the board. I keep track, Miss Marple, because people can be very liberal with the truth, and one must have something to tighten them up with. Quite, Miss Marple said. Then the lady who returned Mr. Harbottle's envelope to his office this morning by hand, as the clerk put it, would have had to walk to Much Benham in the wet along the towpath, past Perkins's stile, over the Weir footbridge and so forth, and back again, in a veil, without being seen by Perkins's daughter, who scrubs the steps at 9 sharp and always looks up for a minute to see if any romances are walking by. Miss Finch's mouth twitched. No romance went by yesterday, Miss Marple. Only old Mr. Fleming's retriever, and that at a trot. If there was a lady, she's one of those conjurers' ladies. She slips her man into a cupboard, and then out comes a bouquet instead. Miss Marple thanked her and came out into a day that had decided to be pale and watery, as if colour were beyond its present powers. In the lane she met Billy, the milk boy, whose loyalty she repaid in many ways, including knowledge. "'Twas Nurse Hart, they say," he volunteered breathlessly. "I don't say it was, mind, but Sally at the lodge says she saw a veil on the newel post in the back passage last night, and when she went to say so to cook this morning it was gone, and Nurse says no, we don't wear veils in a modern house like Christian folk. Sally should be more careful with her pronouns," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "But thank you, Billy dear." On the way up to Arbuthnot Hall, the hedgerows shone with beads, and the rabbits' paths were writ clear as any penmanship on the damp. Miss Marple paused at the lodge to admire the geraniums and to let Sally's gossip spill in proper order. "Veil, yes, miss," Sally said, delighted to be believed ahead of time. "Black net, not mourning per se, but modest, you might say, and tied up with a so-thin ribbon that made my fingers itch to retie it. I don't say who wore it, mind. Could be anybody's. But Nurse Hart's a careful one, and she had words last night with Mr. Hugh in the blue parlour, and I don't say what they were about neither. But if something went missing in the morning-room drawer after lunch, that's not my say-so. It's just what you could read in Cook's face if you knew your letters." "I have always been fond of letters," Miss Marple said. "Did you see who came in late?" No one came, Sally said promptly, eager to be exact. But someone went, miss, without going, if you take me. Back door to chapel wing. Up the little stairs what smell like stone. Across the gallery where the pictures squint at you, down the oratory passage and into the morning room by the green baize door. No front door would report it. You can be in and out of the hall 3 times by that way, and only the lamps know. And they are kept at the order of the A. Nurse. Thank you, Sally, Miss Marple said again. You and I are fond of the same inventions. It pleased her, though she did not say so aloud, to think of the title Inspector Craddock had given this affair in his tired mind. The suspect who left without leaving. For in great houses the trick was not to be elsewhere. It was to be elsewhere on the carpet of the same house. She climbed the side steps and found the green baize door unlatched. Someone in the morning room was playing Patience very badly. The cards fell with the little shushing sound of pasteboard defeated upon polished wood. Mrs. Arbuthnot sat in her shawl with a small mountain range of kings marooned by obstinate red 7s and none of the aces where they ought to be. It will not go, she said irritably as Miss Marple came in. I am very well aware that patience is a lesson, but I cannot think who is to learn it. Ace of hearts beneath the 3 of clubs, Miss Marple said meekly, and Mrs. Arbuthnot at once turned up. The card Miss Marple had imagined into the place Miss Marple had contrived to see by reflection in the glass of the cabinet, a habit you develop when small boys cheat at Old Maid. Oh, Mrs. Arbuthnot said, cheered by the miracle that always came with another mind. Inspector Craddock will be here directly, madam, Miss Hart's voice said from the doorway, even before her neat frame stepped through it. Miss Marple always thought of her as a carefully drawn check mark. She was all correctness. He asks that everyone remain within call. Everyone, Mrs. Arbuthnot said, remains until I say otherwise. I will not be kept like a doll in a doll's house when my papers are spirited out of my own drawer. Miss Marple, do you suppose I have been a fool? Men come and go in this house, with their cigars and their claims and their motor cars that fall ill at the same time as their consciences. And I am to sit and be quiet. I will not be quiet. Miss Hart set the patient's deck aside with emotion, almost tender. Then we will speak softly, she said. To Miss Marple she added, if your inspector means to search the oratory again, I will accompany him. Mrs. Arbuthnot must not be startled by men wandering in and out of her private rooms. Bayberry candles startle no one, Miss Marple said as if to herself. They comfort. A pity they leave such disloyal little ghosts of themselves upon cuffs and sills. A servant edged in with a wicker basket. From the laundry, miss, she said to nurse. Tss. Hart. Returned early because of the water in the lane, and Mrs. Cutler said she will put it on the slate. Miss Hart was already unfolding the top cloth with hands accustomed to corners. Monogrammed napkins lay like white fishes with delicate fins. There was a small bundle of black net as well, knotted once and then twice in a tidy nurse's fashion. You have not to bring me the upper servants' things here, Miss Hart said. Her voice lost a degree of temperature. This is the mistress's room. Yes, miss, the maid stammered, and withdrew. Oh dear, said Miss Marple. I have always thought net a romantic thing until one finds it next to napery. It must be dreadful to be practical about it. Nurse Hart's eyes, which had the virtue of directness even when they did not have the courtesy of warmth, held on Miss Marple's face for a fraction longer than politeness required. Practicality is a virtue, Miss Marple. Without it, the world would tip into the pond. She folded the veil, if a veil it was, to nothing. Inspector Craddock came a few minutes later with the energy people mistake for briskness, when it is, in fact, anger under obedience. He had been to Much Benham. No Pullman, he said to the room at large. No lady walk the towpath. The clerk at Harbottle's office now thinks he cannot say whether the veil was black net or grey dust. He is in love with his memory, and I mean to break up that match." "You will not shout in my house," Mrs. Arbuthnot said dangerously, "unless you mean to shout at the dead man for being murdered inconveniently." Craddock swallowed and bowed slightly, a clumsy movement that did him credit. "Forgive me, madam. I've a temper of my own, and it does not match with foggy mornings." He and Miss Marple went to the chapel wing by the inside way. "You mean to say," Craddock said low, "that all this parade of going to town and returning envelopes is a charade? Someone here, last night, or at first light, went into that vestry, lifted the flag, took what the note told us to look for, and came back to breakfast. Under the nose of the same person who is so very careful that no men wander through her mistress's rooms," Miss Marple said. She did not say Miss Hart's name. She did not need to. "But, Inspector, keep your mind a little ajar. In some houses, the most careful person is not the most guilty. She is only the person upon whom guilt finds it easiest to hang its hat and so look respectable." They found Mr. Linton in the chapel, wing standing under the portrait of some Arbuthnot ancestor who had been painted with a finger pointing at a long-vanished sermon. "Ah," he said in a voice that attempted cheer and tripped over the effort, "our sleuths. I have been in the steward's room reviewing accounts, Inspector. The rain is devil on the roof, and Mrs. Arbuthnot must not have to think of tile. We men must do something useful when women are set on doing something else." Miss Marple had met the sort of man who puts roofs between women and their business. "And the candle you used to see the accounts," she said politely. "Was it Bayberry? The ash on your cuff is so very well behaved." Linton's smile tightened. "You must have been very pretty when you were young, Miss Marple. I see in your face the sort of mind that men used to mistake for a different sort of mind." "I have always been precisely the sort of mind I appear," Miss Marple said. "It saves a great deal of trouble." Craddock, who was not patient with delicacy when a blunt instrument was available, said, "The maid saw you burn a paper in this wing 2 nights ago, Mr. Linton." "Then the maid has a poet's eye," Linton retorted. "I burned only a letter of my own, an unfortunate note concerning a debt I am now rid of, thanks to an aunt who died with a better sense of duty than my creditors." He paused so perfectly after debt that the word itself seemed to have been paid. "You may ask my aunt, if you can." Craddock looked as if he might try. Miss Marple, who believed as a matter of creed that men do not lie as well as women unless very tired, said only, "The oratory, Mr. Linton." He gestured. "By all means." He stood aside with an eagerness to cooperate that was either the varnish of guilt or the inheritance of a boarding school where masters gave out thrashings for sulkiness first, disobedience second. The oratory smelt as it had, a parish woman's clean in its stone and Miss Hart's imported restraint in its candles. On the sill where Miss Marple had seen the smear there was a faint rubbing, as if someone had taken a cloth to it with an eye to later sightseers. On the votive stand, a single wick had burned low and guttered, leaving behind the puddled moss-green signature of Bayberry. "Untidy," Miss Marple remarked, knowing she was being heard through the wall by a woman who had braced many walls. "A tidy person would scrape that and carry the scrap away on the side of a nail." Craddock regarded the green drop as if it were a witness who might be charmed into saying names. "The more they tidy," he said, "the more they set the table for us." They were interrupted there by the small figure of the vicar, who had the look of a man walking in a suit that has been hung for some time in a damp cupboard. "Inspector," he said, swallowing. "Miss Marple, I had hoped—" He looked to Miss Marple for permission to hope, and then decided he did not deserve even borrowed hope. "I can say nothing helpful," he finished wretchedly. "Only that I am made of paper in this matter. I bend and rip." Miss Marple took his hand, which shook. "Then we will keep you out of the rain," she said. "Did Mr. Harbottle ever come to you by the side door?" The vicar blinked. Yes, sometimes. He disliked being seen in the village if he could help it. He thought people gossiped about wills as if they were pudding receipts. He came to me Monday last for my signature on a parish confirmation list, and he smiled in that thin way he had and said, "We may need to use your vestry as a neutral ground, Mr. Goodfellow. There are too many foreign candles at Arbuthnot Hall." I took it for a joke. It is a terrible habit, Miss Marple, to take things for jokes. "Foreign candles," Miss Marple repeated, politely putting aside the pain in the sentence. "Yes." She looked up at the small window and the water on it like old tears. "Inspector, when you have the goodness to bring the clerk again, it might be worthwhile to ask him what he remembers of the lady's shoes. Did they squeak? Did they walk? Or drift?" Craddock made a note. "I will have him remember how many angels fit on the head of the pin, if you require it." They returned to the main house by the servants' passage. In such corridors, the hierarchy of a house speaks in nails and paint. The banister at the turn was worn by many practical hands, not by rings. A scuffed mark on the skirting caught Miss Marple's eye. It was nothing, a graze where a basket had passed too sharp. But to the manner of it clung 3 grains of grit that were neither earth nor ash. She scraped them onto the edge of a visiting card with a fingernail. "Garage gravel," she murmured. "The sort used by a man who keeps his motor in good faith even when it lies to him." Mr. Linton Craddock followed her thought. "Dragged a basket through the passage after coming in that way late. What was in the basket? Paper? Candles? A hatbox?" He stopped, then laughed once without mirth. "We shall die of hatboxes, Miss Marple. We shall die of tidiness," Miss Marple said, "but not before someone else does." They found Hugh Peveril at the billiards table, idly sending the red to kiss a corner and thinking himself languid. He came up from the table at their approach with the quickness of a man whose indolence is a performance. "Again," he said, "I am very flattered." Craddock did not smile. "Mr. Peveril, the Pullman did not run yesterday. Your name on the hatbox label, Pullman car, is as fictitious as your alibi." Hugh's eyes flashed. "I did not write that label, and I did not run to Much Benham in a veil to play postman. I don't even know where the veil box is kept." "It is kept," Miss Marple said mildly, "with the monogrammed napery. One would not look there first, you see, if one were a man. And the label's looped G was made by a person taught to handwrite, like a governess." "A woman wrote it. Then arrest Nurse Hart," Hugh snapped. "She can handwrite prettily enough, I am sure, when she is not writing prescriptions for indignation. She has disliked me from the day I came. She disapproved of my likes on sight." "Do not be tiresome," Miss Marple said, so gently that the injunction fell like a hand over a child's mouth before a church service. "Miss Hart dislikes you because you are that tedious thing. A young man convinced he is interesting. But disliking is not killing. That is a different hobby." "Madam," Hugh said, stung into genuine feeling for the first time, "I have not killed anyone. I did consider once kicking Mr. Harbottle down the steps of his office purely to see if it was possible for a man to bounce that long without smiling. But I did not." Miss Marple looked at him then, not unkindly. "You are a little wicked and a little weak," she said. "The first you enjoy, and the second you excuse. A murderer, my dear, is rarely so clear to himself." Craddock turned away to hide the ghost of a grin, and then sobered, for Miss Hart stood in the doorway. She had an apron over the grey uniform and a little book pinned beneath her watch. "Mrs. Arbuthnot will have broth," she announced, "and you will finish this unpleasantness by tea-time." "By tea-time," Craddock said, "we shall have the solicitor's clerk, who doesn't remember the colour of a veil, and the bridge guard who recalls the number of raindrops on his boots. We shall also have the morning-room patient's deck." Miss Hart's chin lifted a fraction. "The deck is in its place. In its drawer, Miss Marple said, not moving, with one queen missing and the maker's mark, Temple Press, Series C. She had not looked. She had only named what her mind had counted. In old houses, patients' decks go to the drawer like spoons to the case. There are 4 queens of hearts in a house with 4 decks, and only one of them is the right lady. The others are cousins of no importance. But the one we have seen, she has been about her business more than the others. She had powder on her face. Miss Hart did not flush. That would have been an admission of weather. If Mrs. Arbuthnot plays patience while I read aloud of an evening, she said, it is not a matter for policemen. The village will talk about it whether they know it or not. Craddock let that pass. Your rounds, Miss Hart, he said, your little book, if we could see it. This is my case notes, she said, colder. Private to my patient. Private, Craddock said, until a man is dead and a will is in doubt. Then everything belongs to everyone a little. Miss Hart, we do not like it either. I will not give you my notebook, she said, not loud, and that interested Miss Marple more than if she had shouted. It was the first time Nurse Hart had refused on her own behalf and not in Mrs. Arbuthnot's name. Then we shall take it, Craddock said, but he did not reach toward the place on her bodice beneath the watch. He was not a bully. He was only a policeman. Nurse Hart left with her chin still exactly in its place. You will have that book before dusk, Miss Marple said. But perhaps not from her hands. Craddock eyed her. Your village exerts exemplary pressure on stationery, Miss Marple. My village, she said demurely, likes to read. They met at the post office at 3:30. Miss Finch produced a bus ticket, half torn and then not used, out of a little envelope where she kept her curios, the saved string and the stamp a child had licked twice, and regretted. The boy from the hall, Thomas, brought this to swap for a penny. Yesterday, she explained, truth bubbling in her like a kettle. Said he'd found it by the green baize door, on the mat. I told him you cannot swap the world for 1 penny, which may be philosophy and not trade, but he looked a child, and so I let him think me a fool. I kept it because I do not like to be deceived by children. It sets a pattern for later. Craddock took the ticket and turned it in his fingers. The print declared it a much Benham return. The serial numbers did not match Miss Finch's record of stubs sold that morning. Used, he said, or unpunched, Miss Finch supplied, which is a sort of virginal use, Inspector, and always more suspicious than a thing honestly ruined. Left, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, by someone who wished to be thought gone without being gone. Dropped by the baize door, so that a servant would find it, and the house might be furbished with the story of a lady who had to post a letter at once, and so took herself to the bus, and there is nothing at all to see here. It would be very clever, Inspector, if the bridge had not gone out. She never left the house, Craddock said. She went out of it by the chapel passage and into it by the same, and the envelope went to Much Benham by another hand, perhaps this Mr. Linton with his well-behaved ash, who would do as told because he is in debt to so many things at once he does not know the names of half of them. And the suspect, Miss Marple said, is a person in the habit of tidying, who cannot bear to leave any corner showing the former dust. She worded the vicar's letter to keep it delayed, removed the codicil to a place where she could fetch it later, under the vestry flag, and then fetched it when her own sleep had turned the house to sugar quietly. She has left and left and left, and never gone. Miss Hart, Craddock said, not as accusation, only as task. Perhaps, Miss Marple allowed, but do not make her the whole of it, Inspector. She is the sort of woman who sees a young man like Mr. Peveril and desires to see him smaller. She is the sort who takes pride in the exactness of a knot. But this house contains a heavier secret than a nurse's dislike. A will goes missing to hide more than money. She left him then and went back to the hall at an hour when servants yawn and ladies sigh for tea. The morning room was empty. Patients had been stacked and put away with small, precise hands. A draught came at the hem of the curtain near the window and lifted it a finger's breadth. On the table sat Mrs. Arbuthnot's silver bell. Miss Marple did not touch the bell. She went instead to the writing table against the wall, where a blotter lay square and innocent. She took a pencil from the tray and, with the softest shading, brought up the ghost of what the paper lying there yesterday had imprinted. It is a homely trick, older than most, and used by nieces to read a forbidden menu, and by wives to read a husband's expense. Words came, pale as mist, and then darker. Tonight, 11 o'clock. And below that the curve of oratory and the straight back of witness. The hand was firm and had the anger Mr. Harbottle gave his tea when he wished to say mine. But beneath the lines, as if someone else had scribbled a note on top idly with a dull pencil, there was the loop of a G open like a small mouth. A woman's loop, the same Miss Marple had seen on the Pullman label. Bring Vale. And then, abruptly, Journal. Miss Marple stopped her shading. The word had not finished itself. The pencil had caught in a crease. She lifted the blotter and saw what she had not noticed at first. The table was 2 planks together, and between them a crack wide enough to hide a strip of paper or the edge of a book cover. She slid a letter opener down and felt leather. She drew up a small flat book bound in black, without title. It had been pushed flat and left in the crack, a place where a tidy person would think to hide a thing because she would also think to dust there. Miss Marple did not open it. She stood quite still for a moment, listening. The house had the hush of a held note. Somewhere cook was shouting low, which is the way expert shouts travel. Miss Marple put the book back as gently as if it were a sleeping child's hand, and took up the pencil again, shading the blotter to nothing, smoothing it with her palm so that it lay as it had. Then she rang the silver bell because she could not both discover and conceal without taking something from one side and giving to the other, and she preferred to make her thefts even-handed. Nurse Hart came as Miss Marple had expected. "Yes," she said, and looked at the bell as if it had betrayed her by obeying. "I wanted," Miss Marple said, "to ask whether Mrs. Arbuthnot had ever kept a diary." Nurse Hart's eyes moved, not to the crack, they were not so rash, but to the drawer of the patient's table, where secrets had been placed as goats in a field and then rounded up again. "Mrs. Arbuthnot," she said, her voice, very precise, "keeps nothing that would trouble her nights." "Then someone else keeps it for her," Miss Marple said, not as a question. Nurse Hart did not answer. She took up the patient's deck and turned it over in her hands, one card at a time, as a nun might turn the leaves of a psalter. The Queen of Hearts stared up in repetition. In this deck, she was present. There was nothing to see, unless one knew that one card had travelled to a vestry and come back to the morning room's drawer with powder upon her face, as if she had been kissed by a hand that wore a glove dusted by rice. "Miss Hart," Miss Marple said gently, "when a woman has cared for another woman long enough, she begins to sound like her. That is one of the little thefts of duty. But writing belongs to the person whose hand it is. Even when another dictates, the letters are her own. If we were to see the notes pinned beneath your watch, would we hear you in them or someone else?" For the first time since Miss Marple had met her, Nurse Hart looked aside. It was not shame. It was not fear. It was calculation, cool, exact, the mathematics of a person who has been poor in life and therefore rich in the balancing of it. "I have written nothing," she said at last, which, because it was too absolute, was a lie. Miss Marple took her leave with all the unimportance she could make herself possess. She crossed the hall carefully because footmen understand carefulness and do not tell stories about it. She went out into the pale day and down the steps and around the side to the chapel wing again. as if she had forgotten something that belonged to no one. The oratory was empty. She went to the morning room by the green baize door and stood with her back to it until the air quieted. Then she returned to the writing table and lifted the blotter and the letter opener and the black flat book out of its hiding place. It was a journal. On the flyleaf, in a hand that had learned to write in hospitals, where a nurse's pen had to be as clean as her hands, was written: Household Case Notes, Arbuthnot Hall, H. The H had been made with a downward stroke that dug into the paper. The pages smelled faintly of orris, of the sort some women dust across their linen. Miss Marple opened in the middle and read 5 lines only because 5 lines sometimes tell more than 50. Tuesday, 9:45. Mistress agitated after interview with LH. Dose of bromide of 7 grains. Too much for age, but necessary. 10:30 to house quiet. Note: placed under vicar's door by hand, not my own. L to deliver, uncertain. 11:15. Ordered Mr. L to accompany packet to MB. He is slow but obedient. 11:40. Chapel wing arranged, candle ready. HP threatened insolence, corrected with words he understands. 12:05. Vestry. The pencil stopped. The next line was heavily erased. Beneath the lattice work of the rubber one could read only a ghost. Flag. Miss Marple shut the book and stood very still. A step sounded, then another, soft, trained to that, trained to softness. She set the journal back under the blotter in the crack, slid the letter opener in upon it, and put her hand on the bell. When the door opened, it did so only as far as Miss Marple's age permitted. Miss Hart stood just beyond it, as neat as a pin and sharp enough to draw blood. "You have been very busy," Miss Marple said conversationally, without moving her hand from the bell. "More busy than your duties require, more faithful, perhaps, than they deserve." "Our work," Nurse Hart said, "is our virtue." "And sometimes," Miss Marple said, "our sin." They looked at one another for a small, exact time. The house breathed. The fog outside made the windows look like old photographs. Nurse Hart's eyes flickered, not from the book, which she could not see, but to Miss Marple's hand upon the silver bell. "You will ring," she said. "I will," Miss Marple said, "for Inspector Craddock, and for a clerk who forgets the colour of veils, and for a vicar who will remember that doors are not always locked because men put keys in them." She smiled. "But not just yet." Nurse Hart's mouth made the smallest movement, as if rejecting a taste. "You are crueler than you look, Miss Marple." "No," Miss Marple said with charity, "only older. And age is the one thing crueler than any of us. It takes away what you are quite certain you will not give it." She lifted her hand from the bell then, and set it instead upon the blotter, as if smoothing a crease. Nurse Hart watched the motion like a cat watches a child's, ready to strike not yet striking. "Tell me," Miss Marple said almost idly, "when you returned the envelope to Mr. Harbottle's office this morning, did you wear the black veil or the grey? The clerk only remembers dust." Nurse Hart did not blink. She said nothing at all. And in that nothing Miss Marple heard a door close in a corridor and a figure walk away who had never, in fact, left. She left the room before Miss Hart did and went down the passage and into the vestry with her small quick step that never learned to be dramatic because it had learned too much of being useful. Craddock was there, talking to the constable about keys. Miss Marple said to him, "The person we want is the one who is only ever absent on paper. She has hoarded absence like other women hoard sugar. She has made a parcel of it and labelled it Pullman and put it in a basket and told the house it is gone, and yet she has been here all along." She put out her hand then and opened it. On her palm lay not a queen of hearts, Craddock had had his fill of queens, but the thin black ribbon with which a nurse ties a veil in a tidy knot, when she must untie it quickly in the dark. It had clung beneath the writing table's edge with the faintest smear of gum. When Miss Marple had smoothed the blotter, she had found it with the same hand that once found a thorn in a tea rose by touch alone. Craddock looked at the ribbon, then at her, and then at the vestry floor, with its whisper of a crack. "We have her," he said, but he spoke softly, as though she might hear them and make of the softness a shield. Miss Marple closed her hand over the ribbon. "We have a thread," she corrected. "When we pull, we must be prepared for a great deal of cloth to come after it." The bell in the church tower struck the quarter. The sound walked itself about the village like an old man making his rounds. Outside, the fog lifted a fraction. The air held a taste of iron. Miss Marple thought of the black, flat book in the crack of the morning-room table and of the erased line, and of the word that had written itself in the dust of a blotter even after someone had wiped it away. "Journal," she turned to Craddock. "Before you put your hand upon Miss Hart," she said, "put it upon her book." "And then?" he asked. "And then," she said, "read only 5 lines, but they will be the right 5. Chapter 7. The Journal, Hidden in Plain Sight. The rain had returned with renewed vengeance, drumming against the leaded windows of Arbuthnot Hall as though the heavens themselves conspired to keep the household shut in with its secrets. A storm of this kind seemed to wash away all pretences, stripping varnish from old wood and peeling lies from lips too practised in deception. It was in such a moment that Inspector Craddock, his boots damp and his temper shorter still, dropped a slim, black-covered journal onto the table before Miss Marple. "It was found precisely where you said it would be," he muttered, his fingers twitching as though they longed to cuff the nearest suspect, wedged in the writing desk of the morning-room, beneath the blotter. "And no one admits to having seen it." Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her lap, a single loop caught upon her needle, its progress arrested like a thought not yet spoken. She gazed at the journal with something more than curiosity, her pale eyes narrowing as if they could read its contents before it was opened. "It is precisely the sort of place one overlooks," she said mildly. "To hide something in plain sight is always safer than to bury it in gardens or smuggle it away in hat boxes. People imagine thieves think elaborately. More often they do not." Craddock pulled out a chair and sat heavily, rubbing his brow. "The problem, Miss Marple, is that every soul in this house had opportunity to slip it into the desk. Nurse Hart has her duties with Mrs. Arbuthnot. Peveril loiters in every room as if searching for his reflection. Linton prowls like a dog hoping for scraps. And even Mrs. Arbuthnot herself is not beyond a little manoeuvre, if she feels cornered. The trouble is, whoever placed it there never meant it to remain forever. It was to be retrieved when suspicion had cooled. Only we moved a fraction faster." He pushed the journal toward her as though reluctant to sully his hands further. Miss Marple, her fingers careful, untied the ribbon. The cover bore no title, merely a faint indentation where something once pressed upon the leather. When she turned the first page, she was met with lines of cramped, efficient handwriting, entries dated with exact precision. The pages smelled faintly of lavender water, a woman's touch, but the ink strokes had the authority of someone accustomed to record-keeping, someone for whom order was a creed. Miss Marple read silently for several moments. Craddock, restless, leaned back and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like accusation into the air. Then Miss Marple closed the journal softly, her thumb still keeping her place. "It is not what it pretends to be," she said at last. "On the surface it is a nurse's log. Notes of Mrs. Arbuthnot's moods, her medicines, her sleep. Yet within these domestic entries lie other matters. Words struck through, erased, or written in a hurried scrawl, as if the writer's hand ran away from her caution. And those entries. They speak of meetings at strange hours, of letters placed under doors, of documents carried not by the person who ought, but by another pressed into service. It is not a nurse's journal at all. It is a witness account, half diary, half confession. Craddock snatched it back and scanned a line, his frown deepening. Tuesday, household agitated. Note placed under vicar's door, not by my hand. L to deliver, uncertain. And this. 11:40, chapel wing arranged, candle ready. H.P. insolent. Corrected with words he understands. H.P. Hugh Peveril. And chapel wing arranged? What in heaven's name does that mean? It means, Miss Marple said quietly, that someone had prepared the oratory, or perhaps the vestry, for a meeting not intended for the eyes of the rest of the household. Bayberry candles, if I am not mistaken, are not ordinary fare for evening prayer. At that moment, the door opened, and Hugh Peveril himself strolled in, his hair too carefully dishevelled and his voice languid. Still rooting about in old papers, Inspector? One might think the entire British Empire depends on what an old lady wrote about her sleep. Craddock closed the journal sharply. We've found enough to know you were present in scenes you claim to have slept through, Peveril. Care to explain how your initials appear in this record? Hugh's composure faltered only for an instant, then returned with a flash of defiance. What does it matter? Everyone in this house is suspect. If Nurse Hart writes that I was insolent, then it is only because I refused to let her bully me, as she does everyone else. She despises me because I will inherit what she cannot touch. Miss Marple tilted her head. But you see, Mr. Peveril, the journal records not merely insolence, it records correction. Correction implies authority and the power to enforce. How curious that a woman in service should feel herself capable of correcting the heir to this house. Hugh's lips twisted. You don't know. Nurse Hart. She has wormed herself into my grandmother's trust so deeply that she might as well wear the family crest. She prescribes, she commands, she dictates who comes and goes, and my grandmother obeys. It is monstrous. His voice cracked, betraying something rawer than arrogance. Fear. Miss Marple's eyes softened. So, you feel yourself supplanted? That must be very difficult, Mr. Peveril, particularly for a young man who prides himself on his position. To be corrected, like a schoolboy. Craddock rose, sensing the moment teetering on confession, but Hugh only straightened and laughed too loudly. Think what you like, old lady. If I wished my grandmother dead, I would hardly wait for papers to vanish and nurses to scribble journals. I'd simply do it. He flung himself out of the room, leaving the smell of brandy and desperation in his wake. Miss Marple, unperturbed, reopened the journal. Her finger traced another line. You see, Inspector, here. 12:05, Vestry, flag lifted, package removed. It is as plain as day. The codicil, or some other paper of importance, was indeed hidden under the vestry flagstone, and someone, very likely Nurse Hart herself, retrieved it at midnight. Then why record it at all? Craddock demanded. Why keep a journal of your own misdeeds? Miss Marple looked up, her eyes bright. Because some people cannot help themselves. They believe that order, once committed to paper, transforms chaos into something manageable. Nurse Hart is such a woman. Her not writing it down would be unthinkable. She hides it, of course, for she knows the danger, but she cannot resist recording her actions as though it proves her control. Before Craddock could reply, the door creaked again, and Nurse Hart herself entered, carrying a tray of tea. Her face was composed, but her eyes flickered once toward the journal lying exposed on the table. You will forgive me, she said calmly, setting the tray down. But Mrs. Arbuthnot insists you gentlemen fortify yourselves. She dislikes unnecessary disruption. Craddock's hand closed possessively over the journal. Disruption, nurse, is what happens when wills vanish, men are murdered, and servants lie. Care to tell me what this book is doing in your mistress's writing desk? Her composure did not crack. It is my private record. Notes of medication, nothing more. If you choose to interpret them otherwise, that is your prejudice, not my intention." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "A private record? Kept under your own pillow would be more natural, nurse. To wedge it in a desk, where it might be discovered, is peculiar. Almost as though you wished it to be found, but not too soon. A weapon kept for the right moment, perhaps." For the briefest instant, Nurse Hart's mouth tightened, a soldier's reaction to an unexpected thrust. Then she inclined her head. "You have a fertile imagination, Miss Marple." She left the room with her usual economy of movement. Craddock exhaled. "She's as slippery as they come. But we have her, surely." "Not yet," Miss Marple murmured. "The journal condemns her, yes, but it also implicates others. Mr. Linton, Mr. Peveril. She has written enough to cloud the waters. If it is her intention to spread suspicion, then she has succeeded admirably." As evening fell, the storm abated, leaving the world drenched and glistening. The household gathered in the drawing-room, a strained semblance of civility restored by firelight and the clink of teacups. Mrs. Arbuthnot sat enthroned in her armchair, her frailty a shield sharper than steel. Hugh prowled near the mantel, restless. Linton pretended to read, though his eyes darted constantly to the door. Nurse Hart stood beside her mistress, serene. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, seemed the least engaged of all, though her eyes flickered from face to face, noting each twitch, each too quick glance. She recalled something her late nephew had once said about card games. The skill was not in playing one's hand, but in watching how the others tried to play theirs. At length, she spoke into the uneasy silence. "It is remarkable how the truth often sits before our eyes, ignored because we do not expect it there. Like a journal hidden in a desk, or a will placed in a drawer where anyone might open it. One might almost think that the person who hides such things wishes not to conceal them forever, but to ensure they will be found, by the right eyes, at the right time." Her words fell like a pebble into, still, water. Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand trembled upon her shawl. Hugh stopped pacing. Linton's knuckles whitened upon his book. Nurse Hart, alone, did not stir. Craddock leaned toward Miss Marple. "And what are you implying?" Miss Marple's gaze rested gently upon Mrs. Arbuthnot. "That sometimes, Inspector, it is not the servants who play games of concealment, but their masters. And that the greatest clue may not lie in what is written in a journal, but in what is not written. Entire days omitted, conversations unrecorded, meetings curiously absent. Silence, you see, can be as telling as speech." The old lady gave a short, brittle laugh. "You suggest I keep secrets, Miss Marple? At my age, I have no strength for secrets." "Oh, but madam," Miss Marple said kindly, "it requires very little strength to let others do the work of hiding for you." The room shivered with unspoken tension. Then, with a suddenness that startled all present, a footman entered, his face pale. In his hand he bore an envelope, damp from the rain. "Delivered just now by a boy from the village, ma'am," he said, extending it to Craddock. The inspector tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. "The journal is only half the truth. Look to the portrait in the blue parlour, and you will see what was never meant to be seen." The room fell into stunned silence. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, then stilled. Her eyes, bright as candle flames, lifted to the inspector. "Well," she murmured, "it appears the past has not finished speaking. We must go to the blue parlour at once." And as the household stirred with whispers and unease, the storm outside gathered its breath again, as though eager to bear witness to whatever revelation the portrait concealed. Chapter 8. A Whisper Heard Behind the Organ Pipes. The church at St. Mary Mead had always been a place of quiet dignity, its stones seasoned by centuries of worship, its oak pews polished smooth by generations of parishioners. Yet, on this particular night, the air inside carried a tension more suited to a theatre waiting for the curtain to rise. A storm had pressed down upon the village since dusk, filling the lanes with rivulets and battering shutters until the whole countryside seemed to hold its breath. And it was in the midst of that storm, long after the lamps in the cottages had gone dark, that Miss Marple found herself once again within the vestry, standing beside Inspector Craddock as he examined the chamber with a lantern. The discovery of the anonymous note directing them to the Blue Parlour's portrait had left the household in a ferment, but Miss Marple had insisted on detouring to the church first. "It is often so, Inspector," she said mildly, as her sharp eyes moved across the cold flagstones, "that one finds an answer not in the clamour of parlours, but in the silences where no one believes themselves observed." Craddock grumbled but humoured her, setting the lantern upon the base of the great pipe organ that rose like a forest of silver trunks above the choir stalls. Its gilt mouthpieces caught the flicker of the flame and returned it in uneasy glints. The storm outside moaned faintly through the roof slates, giving the illusion that the pipes themselves were murmuring. They had scarcely taken 3 steps when a sound reached them. It was not the wind. It was low, strained, intimate, the unmistakable cadence of human speech. Miss Marple froze, her small figure still as carved stone. The whisper came again, this time clearer, carried along the channels of the organ's innards. It was a man's voice, rough with urgency. "You must get rid of it before morning. If they find it, finished." Another voice, higher and quick like a bird, responded. "Not here. Not in the church." The words trailed off, muffled, as though the speakers had retreated deeper into the passages that ran behind the organ loft. Craddock's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the stair that wound up into the gallery, but Miss Marple laid a hand on his sleeve. "No, Inspector. If we startle them, they will vanish like mist, and we will be left chasing shadows. Better to listen and remember. There is more to be learned from what people say when they believe themselves alone than from any interrogation." Craddock, impatient but not unwise, inclined his head. They waited, ears straining. For several minutes only the storm replied. Then came the soft scrape of a panel closing, and the whispers were gone. Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze resting upon the carved case of the organ. "There is a passage behind there, Inspector. Old churches have them, for maintenance or for hiding during less peaceful times. I believe our whisperers have made good their escape." Craddock swore, under his breath. "Who was it? Did you recognize the voices?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained grave. "The lower voice belonged to a man who has lived too much upon cigars and not enough upon truth. The other, quick, nervous, that was a woman's, but not Nurse Hart. No, hers is too firm, too composed. This was someone less accustomed to deception, yet driven to it." Craddock looked at her in exasperation. "You hear inflections where I hear nothing but muttering." "A lifetime of tea with one's neighbours, Inspector, teaches one to discern a good deal from how people murmur," Miss Marple said with gentle reproach. They resumed their inspection, and it was then that Miss Marple's eye fell upon the small bench before the organ. Upon it lay a scattering of wax flakes, green, brittle, unmistakably Bayberry. She bent, examining them closely. "Our candles again," she murmured. "But why here? Unless someone sought to illuminate the passages behind the pipes during their clandestine meeting." Craddock crouched beside her. "So it ties back to the oratory, to the same hand." "Or to the same household," Miss Marple corrected softly. The next morning dawned pale with mist clinging to the hedgerows. At Arbuthnot Hall, the household gathered for breakfast under a pall of suspicion so heavy it might have been another storm cloud. Mrs. Arbuthnot presided from her high-backed chair, her delicate hands resting upon the table like relics. Hugh Peveril lounged insolently, at her right, his eyes bloodshot, while Mr. Linton buttered his toast with unnecessary force. Nurse Hart moved silently about, precise as ever, pouring coffee. Miss Marple took her modest seat, her knitting bag beside her, and quietly observed. She saw how Hugh avoided Linton's gaze, how Linton's jaw clenched each time Nurse Hart's shoes clicked upon the floor, how Mrs. Arbuthnot's fingers trembled just slightly when she lifted her cup. To the casual eye, it was an ordinary breakfast. To hers, it was a battlefield, each skirmish fought with glances and silence. Craddock entered with his usual abruptness and laid the journal upon the sideboard. "This," he declared, "will be the ruin of someone here. Perhaps more than one." The room stiffened. Hugh sneered. "Still harping on that wretched diary. It's nothing but Nurse Hart's fancies." Linton's knife clattered against his plate. "You would say so, Peveril. Convenient to blame the woman who has given more loyalty to this house than you ever will." Hugh half rose, but Miss Marple's quiet voice cut through their quarrel. "Gentlemen, it is of little use to quarrel when truth will soon have the final word. What matters is not who wrote the words, but why certain things were omitted. One finds, if one examines carefully, that the silences speak louder than the entries." She allowed her gaze to rest lightly on Mrs. Arbuthnot, who shifted beneath the shawl drawn tightly round her shoulders. Nurse Hart intervened briskly. "Mrs. Arbuthnot must not be agitated. If this investigation must continue, let it do so elsewhere." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, perhaps the church is more fitting. For last night, Inspector and I overheard a most curious exchange behind the organ pipes. Two voices speaking of something that must be gotten rid of before morning. What could that be, I wonder?" The effect was electric. Hugh's cup rattled against its saucer. Linton's hand froze mid-gesture. Nurse Hart's composure flickered, for the briefest instant, and Mrs. Arbuthnot let out a faint gasp, so soft one might have mistaken it for the sigh of age, except that her eyes betrayed sudden fear. Craddock's gaze swept the table. "So, two of you were meeting in secret last night. We will find out who." But Miss Marple's attention was caught by something subtler, the way Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand fluttered toward her throat, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her gown. It was an unconscious gesture, yet revealing. Miss Marple tucked the observation away, as neatly as she would a dropped stitch. Later that afternoon, while Craddock pursued interviews with the household, Miss Marple returned alone to the church. The storm had left puddles shining like glass along the path, and the air smelt of wet stone and hymn books. She mounted the gallery stair, her light step making no sound. At the top she examined the organ closely. A narrow panel cunningly concealed within the carved wood bore faint scratches near its edge, as though it had been moved often of late. With a gentle push, it yielded, revealing a narrow passage that ran behind the pipes. The space was close and dark, smelling of dust and candle smoke. Miss Marple advanced carefully, her fingers brushing the rough wall, and there, in a niche behind the pipes, she found a fragment of paper torn from a larger sheet. She smoothed it with her handkerchief. Upon it were 3 words in a man's hurried scrawl: "Portrait document tonight." Her pulse quickened, though her manner remained outwardly serene. So the note that had sent them to the blue parlour had originated here. And more importantly, it proved collusion between at least 2 people, one with access to the hall's secrets, another using the church's hidden places to plot. As she turned to leave, a sound reached her. Not the storm this time, but a faint creak upon the stair below. Someone else was in the church. Miss Marple held her breath, concealed behind the pipes. A figure moved in the shadows, pausing as though to listen. She glimpsed only a silhouette, tall and broad, before it melted into the nave. Whoever it was, they had come seeking the same passage, and perhaps the very scrap of paper she now held in her handkerchief. When she returned to the hall, she found Craddock waiting in the library. He looked weary, but his eyes lit at her discovery. So the portrait in the blue parlour, the whispers in the church, the missing codicil, they all connect. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. And the danger is that we are being led, step by step, precisely where someone wishes us to go. A clever misdirection, like a conjurer's trick. Craddock leaned forward. And what do you propose? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That we do as we are bid. We shall go to the blue parlour tonight. But we shall go prepared. And perhaps this time it will be the whisperers who are surprised. As the clock in the hall chimed the hour, thunder rolled again across the countryside, heralding another storm. Within Arbuthnot Hall, lamps were lit, shadows stretched, and the inhabitants braced themselves for another night of secrets. And above it all, Miss Marple's quiet certainty lingered, that the truth, though whispered, though hidden, would not remain silent forever. For at the heart of the matter was not merely a missing will or a vanished hatbox, but something deeper, a document concealed in a portrait, a secret guarded behind organ pipes, and a murderer who believed the storm would wash their sins away. Miss Marple knew better, and as the wind rattled the shutters, she folded the scrap of paper and tucked it into her reticule, her eyes bright with quiet resolve. The next step in the mystery would come tonight, when the portrait in the blue parlour revealed what it had hidden for far too long. Chapter 9. The Trap Set at Midnight Mass. The blue parlour was not usually a room for sharp voices. Afternoon light loved it too much. It poured in across the pale carpet and made a business of silver frames and china shepherdesses. Yet, on this wet December evening, a cry, thin as a torn thread, ran from the doorway to the wainscot and back again. The footman had found the portrait not square upon its nail, but yawning from the wall, its wire snapped neatly, as if by a careful hand. Behind the frame, the velvet lining was scored in two clean arcs where something had been prized aside. The cavity was empty. A smear, faint and greenish, marked the inner edge, no bigger than a fingerprint. Babery again. Inspector Craddock arrived at a trot, his greatcoat dark from the weather. He examined the cut wire, sniffed at the smear, and looked at Miss Marple, who stood with her hands folded on the head of her umbrella, as if umbrellas had always been her preferred form of sabre. "Whoever came for it," he said, "came with a candle and a knife. I could respect the honesty if I did not loathe the theft." "Their honesty is in their tidiness," Miss Marple said mildly, "and that always betrays them in the end." She looked once at Mrs. Arbuthnot, who sat rigid with indignation in a low chair beneath the staring faces of long-dead Arbuthnot's. A thin chain disappeared at the old lady's collar, a chain Miss Marple had seen her touch, unconsciously, at breakfast when Craddock had spoken of whispers in the church. The hand went there again now, as if to something that comforted or condemned. "We will seal the room," Craddock announced, "and we will set watchers at the chapel passage and at the green baize door." He hesitated, then added, "It is Christmas Eve. The vicar tells me he will hold midnight service. The village expects it even with the storm. I do not like to ask men to keep to stations when they might be in church." "It would be a pity to disappoint the village," Miss Marple said, eyes very bright. "And an opportunity to oblige our thief to keep an appointment." Craddock, who had learned to look for traps when she grew benign, waited. "A person who believes themselves clever," Miss Marple went on, "believes themselves more clever in church. It is a place where any footstep or whisper can be explained at once by piety. People forgive movement in a pew because their knees complain. They are indulgent when the organ loft creaks. And a vestry door that stands open, which it should not is overlooked because the vicar is always forgetting something." Craddock nodded. "Midnight mass, then?" A crowd for cover. You propose to set a snare. Only a thread or two, Miss Marple said. No nets. Threads are better. Guilty people trip themselves. She turned with a grandmother's apology to Mrs. Arbuthnot. Forgive me, madam, but I must be very silly for a moment. Did you ever, as a girl, hide anything behind that picture? Mrs. Arbuthnot's face moved in a quick, private way, and then stiffened. No, she said. I allowed my maid to hide her ignorance there once when she mislaid the keys. If you must inquire into the follies of youth, Miss Marple, pray begin with your own. That would make a very short list, Miss Marple said gently. I was a dull girl and have never been quite forgiven for it. But I note the scratch upon the velvet. 2 arcs, not 1. That suggests a thing put there, taken out, and then replaced, and then taken again. A person undecided. We must force them to decide. When the servants had gone and the room was sealed with Craddock's authority, Miss Marple lifted very lightly one corner of the fallen portrait. The frame, she said, smells of orris powder. She caught Craddock's glance and smiled. I always think of the dressing table when I smell it. Nurse Hart, Craddock muttered. Or Mrs. Arbuthnot. Or any woman in a good house, Miss Marple returned. Do not be hustled by sense, Inspector. They are like gossip. They go everywhere and mean everything until they mean nothing. She left the hall before dark settled completely, the storm pressing low like a hand upon the village roof. The church path was a grey ribbon, and the yews along the boundary made a whispering of their own. In the organ loft, with Craddock's lantern shuttered and a constable's patient stationed at the base of the stair, she examined the narrow panel where she had found the passage the night before. A shallow nick marked the upper hinge. Fresh cut. Someone had a habit of opening it lately and had used a knife too large for the neatness required. She laid a hair-fine length of knitting wool across the join and tacked it with a dot of wax so small even careful hands might not feel it. A thread, after all, is only a thread until it is broken and becomes a sign. Down in the vestry she inspected the flag again, the one that had held the codicil and then not held it when the anonymous note had made them late. She dusted the crack with the side of a pencil, then pressed a strip of thin paper into the line and lifted it. A faint score showed where something narrow had slid across, twice. Lifted last night, she said, and again an hour ago. Who has had the church keys since? Craddock asked tightly. The vicar, Miss Marple said, and a frightened man will either hold a key like a talisman or mislay it in his sleeve. Mr. Goodfellow is not the sort to mislay, she added, because she had seen how he took his teacup, both hands, exactness learned from grief. If he has been used, it is by someone who can scold him into believing it is duty. Craddock glanced toward the rectory, where a lamp made a square on the lawn. Nurse Hart, he said again. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but do not end your hunt at the first stopping place. In the organ loft, you will please place a second constable behind the case near the narrow panel. And in the blue parlour, Inspector, one request. Permit me the portrait for an hour before the service. You mean to bait it, he said. On the contrary, she said. I mean to empty it so that those who believe it holds their salvation will have to run and find salvation elsewhere. It is hard on the soul, Inspector, to watch a door and know there is nothing behind it. He watched her as one watches a card player about to perform a minor miracle and nodded. Do as you like. I will put Harris at the baize door and Miller at the chapel passage. If anyone leaves without leaving, we shall... No. She went first to the vicarage with a little parcel tied in brown paper. Mr. Goodfellow himself answered the bell, pale and flurried. He had a face that had ceased to be his own since Harbottle's body lay upon his floor. Miss Marple, he began miserably, if you have come to tell me anything, I cannot bear it. I have come to take something away, she said gently. A weight, I want, if you please, the hymn numbers for tonight, placed upon the board at 11 minutes to 12. Number 98, then 203, then 41. Of course, he said, bewildered. But why? Because, Miss Marple said, those numbers will be wrong, and you will not correct them. He stared. But if anyone corrects them, she said kindly, we shall know who cannot pass by a disorder without putting a hand to it. And if they do not, then I shall have been foolish. I am sometimes foolish. It is a relief to the character. He made a sound that might, in a braver man, have been a laugh, and took the parcel from her. And this? Inside, she said, is a paper that looks very like a codicil from a little distance. You will place it upon the vestry table beneath the bell rope and set a weight on it. A pewter inkstand will do. You intend to announce. I intend to say nothing, Miss Marple corrected. You will go about your worship and make no mention of business, but you will leave the vestry door not quite latched when the procession returns. It is a wicked thing to ask. A vicar to do, she added contritely. And I am sorry. Needs must. He flushed, and then strangely straightened. If the devil is to be caught by a little liturgical carelessness, he said, I may yet find some theology to excuse it. By 10 o'clock the rain had settled into a fine, determined mist, a wet that preferred caressing to beating. The village came up to the church like obedient sheep. Lamps bobbed along the lane, the bell tolled slow and very lovely, and the nave filled with the good smell of damp wool, hair tonic, and prayer books. Arbuthnot Hall's pew was occupied. Mrs. Arbuthnot, smaller than the carved ends of the bench, wore black satin with a shawl like a fog upon her shoulders. Nurse Hart stood just behind, her profile accurate as engraving. Hugh Peveril, too splendid by half in a dark coat that could not hide the carelessness beneath, sat restive at the end. Mr. Linton took his place with an air of having done something useful in the last hour and intending to be thanked for it presently. Miss Marple chose a spot beneath the north window, the draughtiest place, because draughts carry whispers, and because no one sits there if they can help it. Inspector Craddock stood at the back under the gallery, an usher of a new sect, and made himself an ordinary man by the practice of it. The choir, brave and thin, lifted their voices. The organ's first notes flowed like thick, warm air through a cold room. The service began. At 11 minutes to 12 the vicar went to the hymn board and placed the numbers Miss Marple had given him. He did not stumble, though the wrongness of it made his hands shake. 98, 203, 41. In the pew directly behind Miss Marple, Mrs. Price Ridley hissed softly, "That will never do," and half rose. Her daughter took hold of her sleeve and pulled her down as one would a jumping cat. Across the aisle, Nurse Hart's head made a very small, very disapproving tilt. Her hands, folded one upon the other, did not untwine. Mr. Linton took out his handkerchief and replaced it. He had the look of a man who watches a crooked picture with his teeth clenched. Hugh Peveril never noticed the board at all. He was counting the hair of a girl 2 pews ahead in a manner that would have earned him a rap from a governess in a better house. When the gospel was read, Miss Marple rose on the first lines as one ought. When the piece was pronounced, she watched the pews loosen and knit again. And when the procession moved, to the vestry at the end, she noted, and no one else did, that Nurse Hart's eyes did not follow the cross, but flicked to the right toward the side door to the chapel wing. Craddock's man waiting in the shadow there touched his ear. Miss Marple made no sign. Threads. They sang Adeste Fideles, as if stubbornness were a grace. The last verse rang in the beams. The vicar and the servers processed out toward the vestry. At the organ, Mr. Jeffreys lifted both hands for the last chord, and in the eye loft, where the narrow panel hid the little passage, Miss Marple saw her thread of wool quiver and fall. It was like watching a spider's web go slack. She did not look up. She looked down to see whether Nurse Hart would move. She did not. Mr. Linton, however, put his hand upon the pew back as if to steady himself. His first 2 fingers were nicked, and one had a line of wax in the cut, like a pale vein. He had not seen it. Men never do. In the vestry, out of sight, a drawer opened. The pewter, inkstand rattled on wood. The vicar's bell rope stirred. Miss Marple, standing with her hymn book open to the wrong hymn by design, felt the church gather itself. Craddock went like a shadow up the stair to the loft. A constable moved at the base of the organ. A woman in the far pew sobbed, because at Christmas a woman will sob whether she has cause or not, and the noise hid 3 footsteps that would otherwise have seemed odd. Then it began, the small scuffle, the catch of breath. Craddock's voice, not loud, saying, "No, Mr. Linton, Mr. Jeffreys," whose fingers were adequate to bark but not to emergencies, pulled the wrong stop, and the vox humana bleated like an indignant sheep. In the aisle, Hugh Peveril turned, at last entertained, and saw nothing he could turn into a story to flatter himself. Nurse Hart did not turn at all. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them upon Mrs. Arbuthnot's profile, as if to steady something with her gaze. They brought Linton out, not in irons, but in dignity spoiled. He had a cut upon his hand and a smear of wax upon his cuff that would never come out with anything but spirits. In his inside pocket, Craddock held, with 2 fingers, and an expression, like a man obliged to pick up someone else's broth, a folded paper. It was not a codicil. It was a list of accounts and deliveries in Mr. Linton's hand: coal, roofing tiles, candles, Bayberry, 6 dozen by post, and at the bottom, in a different, hastier script, portrait, document, tonight. The same hand as the scrap from behind the organ. "Steward's work," Linton said, a sort of angry politeness in his voice. Men of his sort have to carry it round as a tool. "I was to see that nothing went wrong." "And everything has," Craddock said, not unkindly. "Beginning with your choice of confidences." "Who asked you to see that nothing went wrong?" Miss Marple said without looking at him. Her eyes were on the hymn board, where the wrong numbers still shamed the wall. The vicar had obeyed. The village had sung what they were given. Who uses the language of a person who thinks she is in charge of a household in perpetuity? Linton's mouth took its hard line. He looked at Nurse Hart. He should not have done. Looking is as good as pointing in a church. Nurse Hart did not so much as incline her head. Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand went to the chain at her throat again. Craddock took his man and Linton into the vestry, where nobody prayed just then. The church exhaled. Miss Marple sat very still. She was not interested in Linton, who was a hinge upon which someone else had turned. She waited for the real movement. It came at once, the smallest push of air at the chapel door, as if it had remembered something. Harris, Craddock's constable, looked toward the green baize door, and then toward Miss Marple without meaning to. She moved then, with the unhurried briskness of a woman who has always timed her steps to kettles and ovens. The blue parlour was not empty. A lamp burned low, turned, down so that the surface of the little writing table shone with a thin skin of light. The portrait hung square and innocent. Before the table stood Nurse Hart. She had the silver bell in her hand, and she was not ringing it. She put it down as Miss Marple entered. "You have won," she said quietly. "I should be glad, I suppose." "I doubt very much," Miss Marple said, "that winning is anything like as interesting as people think. The moment after is always dull." She crossed to the portrait, laid her fingers to the lower right, where the velvet lining made its delicate creak, and released the catch that did not look like a catch at all. The frame swung forward. "You came to retrieve something someone had not left," she observed. "It makes one feel foolish, does it not, to put one's hand into a cupboard and find the cake gone?" Nurse Hart was not, after all, a woman to waste words pleading innocence. "Mr. Linton has been clumsy," she said, "but then that is his history." "He burned a paper in the oratory," Miss Marple agreed. "Not the paper that mattered. Burning a thing sometimes makes it realer in memory. A tidy person prefers it." Nurse Hart's eyes moved, just once to the crack in the writing table where Miss Marple had earlier found the journal, then back. "You should leave this house now, Miss Marple," she said. "You have set men running and frightened women into honesty. That is a cruel kindness." "I do not think cruelty is mine tonight," Miss Marple said. "I think it belongs to another evening, another house, and a girl who discovered that she might be corrected like a servant and never forgiven like a daughter." Nurse Hart did not start. She closed her hands together until the knuckles were pale. "You know too much," she said. "It is the vice of old women," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "We know too much, and are believed too little. A useful combination." She touched the velvet backing where the green smear had been. "Nothing there now. You see, when the portrait was opened this afternoon, the thing that ought to have been there had already been moved. In some houses, madam, the greatest secret is not paper but parentage." Mrs. Arbuthnot stood in the doorway. The chain at her throat had worked itself free of her collar and showed a small locket at the end, an old-fashioned thing, a token of a girl who had wished always to be a woman in a hurry. "You will not speak in my house," she said to Nurse Hart, not loudly, but with a finality that had been long polished. "You have spoken for too long." Nurse Hart's composure bent, just a fraction, at the sound of that authority. "Madam," she began. Miss Marple lifted her hand. "Number we will have the reading in the proper place." She nodded to the writing table. "Fetch your book, Miss Hart." Nurse Hart did not move. "It is not mine," she said. "It is this house's." "It is the history of your work in it," Miss Marple said, "and of your undoing." She looked at Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Madam, when men have the money and women have the housekeeping, there is only one document a woman can use as a cudgel, and you gave it once to a man who did not keep it safe." Mrs. Arbuthnot's face, which had been the colour of lace, took on life like paper in a draught. "I wrote one will when I was foolish," she said. "I wrote another when I was angrier than any woman should be, and I wrote a third when I was ill and meant to be kind." "And the first," Miss Marple said, "you hid behind the portrait." "The second, Mr. Harbottle helped you compose and intended to deposit in the vestry. The third—" "I do not remember," Mrs. Arbuthnot said. It was the most terrible thing she had said yet. "I am old, Miss Marple. They have talked over me. They have smoothed my hands and put bells to them. I remember being told to sign with my good pen because the other spat. I remember a candle because the switch was stiff. I remember the way one crosses a T when one is very angry." Nurse Hart said with sudden plainness, "She meant to restore what she had first promised." "To whom?" Craddock asked from the doorway, and his voice, for the first time in 3 days, was very gentle. He held Mr. Linton's list in his hand and had left Mr. Linton in a pew between 2 constables and the responsibility of God. "To the one with the name," Miss Marple said. "All this time we have been teased by initials on a hat. H.P. stitched into the sweatband by a woman's neat hand. We were meant to think Hugh Peveril. But initial games are a nurse's entertainment. The first will behind the portrait would have had a name in full. The locket at Mrs. Arbuthnot's neck has a hair within. Not Mr. Arbuthnot's. A woman's. The journal on the flyleaf bears only H, written by a woman who hides her surname. And 20 years ago there was a girl at Arbuthnot Hall not called Hart at all." Nurse Hart, the name so tidy it could have been laundered, closed her eyes. "I was called Harriet," she said tonelessly. "Harriet Peveril." Craddock let out an oath that had the proper shape for a prayer if not the proper words. Mrs. Arbuthnot did not look at Nurse Hart. She looked past her, at the young portrait on the wall, the one that had shielded a first will and a last hiding place. "You were my ward," she said, because there was not another word I could use. "And Mr. Hugh," Miss Marple said, almost sorrowfully, "was given the name you could give publicly. He deserved very little and received too much. Miss Hart, Miss Peveril received too little and took what she believed was owed. Between those two injustices a lawyer died and papers travelled like birds who cannot find their own country." Nurse Hart, Harriet, made a small, clear movement with her hand, the way she might have smoothed a sheet. "I never meant him dead," she said, and Miss Marple believed her. "Only delayed. He was a bad man who liked the feeling of holding up a house with one finger. I wanted the paper he carried so that it could be put with the one in the portrait, and the clerk could be told the matter was settled. Linton is a fool but obedient. He took candles and then took fright. The vicar is a child and left a door open because he has always left doors open. And I am a nurse. I have kept fevers and small lives from death by tidying, Miss Marple. I believed I could tidy this." "And when Mr. Harbottle did not tidy," Miss Marple said, "someone's hand went too hard to his throat. It was not yours." Harriet's eyes flickered, just as men's eyes do when they are honest against their own convenience. "No." Her voice dropped. "I found him. I fetched the envelope. I placed the card because I needed something for you to look at. I put the hat in the box because I knew you would follow the wrong HP. I have lived a life of initials," she added wearily. "I knew what men like you," she looked at Craddock, "believe of letters." Craddock took it without anger. "And who?" he said. "Who put his hand to Mr. Harbottle's neck?" The house answered him. That peculiar, old house noise, the one that runs from stair to corridor to panel like a thought one cannot shake, moved from the passage to the threshold. Hugh Peveril was in the doorway, not swaggering now. He had a look on his face that men wear when they discover they are not the sort of son they thought and not the sort of man they hoped. He had heard enough. A flippancy died in him, and something better, or worse, took its place. "I did not kill him," he said hoarsely. "I came because Harriet, Miss Hart, told me to come to the oratory and be quiet, and for once in my life I obeyed. He was dead when I looked. I wanted—" He swallowed. "I wanted it to be my money anyway. That is a nasty thing to say in a church night, but it is true. I am not a good man, Miss Marple." "You are a young one," Miss Marple said. "It is a curable condition, although some never cure it." "Then who?" Craddock demanded, but it was not a demand of rage. It was the question that had been present in the blue parlour from the first time the word will had been spoken out loud. Miss Marple looked from Harriet to Mrs. Arbuthnot and back to the portrait. It is almost always the person who believes they will never be suspected because their hands are weak or their name is wrong for wrongdoing. "Not me," Mrs. Arbuthnot said, with a sort of queenliness that one believed because she believed it. "I did not kill. I am guilty of other things." The bell of the church, which had been silent since the procession, tolled, once and then again. It was the vicar's signal that his patience had ended and his theology required the closing hymn. Craddock turned his head toward the sound and then back. "We must finish this in the morning," he said reluctantly. "I will take Miss Hart's journal now." Harriet hesitated, then went to the writing table, lifted the blotter, and slid out the flat black book. She laid it in Craddock's hand as carefully as she would lay a thermometer into a nurse tray. He opened without reading, counted 5 leaves, and looked at Miss Marple like a man who does a thing because a woman has asked him to, against his training. 5 lines, he murmured. The old lady's command from that afternoon. He found them, reading just enough to make a line of sense. 12:05 Vestry, flag lifted, package removed. 12:12, voice in organ loft not ours. 12:20, portrait empty, chain taken. 12:23, HP male, sent to billiards. HP female, in control. L incompetent. He shut the book. 2 HPs, he said. 1. We have. The other has put his hand to what he ought not several times, Miss Marple said, and always with a scent of smoke. She took the smallest step toward the door. Inspector, forgive me, but you must catch your breath before you chase again. The person we want is in the church still. He cannot resist putting a hymn right when it is wrong. The board, Craddock said, almost laughing with fatigue and admiration, and was gone. Miss Marple was left in the blue parlour with 2 women and a man who had believed himself a boy longer than was graceful. Mrs. Arbuthnot sat very still and then, with a great decision, unclasped the chain from her throat. She laid the locket upon the table. I will write once more, she said, and this time I will not be angry. It is a poor time of year for anger. Miss Marple, if you are cruel, do it quickly. I am not cruel, Miss Marple said. I am only neat. She glanced at Harriet. You will not tidy tonight. Harriet almost smiled. No, she said. For once I will let the dust show. In the church beyond the walls, a voice cried out, not in pain, not in triumph, but the peculiar strangled alarm men make when they are caught not by wrists, but by understanding. Craddock's voice followed, sharper. Footsteps, a small chaos moving toward order. Miss Marple, who had waited a very long time for certain footfalls, turned to the others and said, You will forgive me if I go and listen. I have found that the first words a caught man says, tell you what he believes about himself. The second tell you what he hopes you will believe about him. She reached the door and paused, because some perversity in her wanted to leave one untidy thing in the room. She left the portrait open. The velvet-lined cavity showed nothing. Yet, without thinking, she touched the inner lip and felt, beneath the pile, a ridge like a seam. It ran down and ended under a corner where velvet did not quite meet frame. Her knitting needle, she would have laughed if she had been a woman who laughed at her own habits, slipped under and lifted. A thin packet came free, stiff with age and tied with a once-white tape. The seal upon it had been broken long ago and resealed clumsily, not by a lawyer's signet, but with the flat face of a locket press. The ink upon the outside had bled into the fibres with years, but it could still be read. Last Will and Testament of Dorothea Arbuthnot, née Lacey, 1911. And beneath, in Mr. Harbottle's neat, hateful hand, to be, superseded upon marriage settlement unless otherwise directed. Miss Marple's heart made the smallest hop. She did not open it. She did not have to. There was, in the bottom left corner, the tail of a name where the page within showed through. Riot Peveril. She set the packet down on the table so that it asked to be seen but did not force seeing. She looked at Harriet, whose hands had gone to her sides as if to still them. She looked at Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was not weeping because she had always despised weeping in herself. Midnight mass, Miss Marple said softly, half to herself. A very good time to tell the truth. The church door banged, voices came nearer, Craddock's steps ran with purpose. He entered without ceremony, his face set, his hand on the arm of a man who flinched at lamplight, as if it were exposure. It was not Linton, whose shame was of another order. It was the vicar's churchwarden, Mr. Jeffreys the organist, his fingers black with graphite, his collar askew, his breath sharp with the stale sweetness of someone who has smoked where no one saw. He corrected the numbers, Craddock said grimly. He could not help himself. And behind the organ under the panel, we found this. He held out, by a corner, the Queen of Hearts. Temple Press, Series C, its face smudged with a brownish thumb like a brand. He saw the wool, and thought himself clever enough to break it and replace it. He is not clever enough, Miss Marple. Jeffries, who was a small man made important by a large instrument, shut his eyes. He was in my way, he said dully. He talked of changing bequests as if he were God. He came into the church with his papers and his smell and treated me as a piece of furniture. I wanted him to be quiet. I am a fool. You are, Miss Marple said, not unkindly. But you are the wrong fool. You have kept bad company with other people's cleverness. She touched the packet on the table. There is still the matter of a will, Inspector, and of what a woman meant, and then unmeant, and then meant again. But for tonight... She looked at the locket on the table and at Harriet's face above it. For tonight we have enough to sing. Craddock nodded, and the tiredness around his mouth softened. He told his men what was needed. They went to their business with the relief of people who have been holding up a roof and may now lean against it. The church bell chimed once, twice, the sound landing on the wet world outside like a kind hand. Miss Marple picked up her umbrella and the little silver bell and set them both into Mrs. Arbuthnot's hands. Ring, she said gently, not for servants, for yourself. The old lady, who had commanded all her life and perhaps had never asked, lifted the bell, and for the first time that day she smiled like a girl. It was not tidy. It was very beautiful. In the passage, Miss Marple paused, her fingers remembering the texture of velvet and old paper. The packet lay there, and with it, the name that had been stitched into a hat, scrawled upon a false label, buried in a journal initial, whispered behind pipes. H.P. Harriet Peveril. It had been in the house from the beginning, hidden in plain sight. She went out into the chill, where the air smelt of stone and wax and a village's breath, thinking that truth can be like that. A letter in a name that everyone spells wrong on purpose. And as she stepped into the nave, the choir began the last hymn, and the organ, oddly pure now that the worst of its secrets had been, exhaled, lifted the tune with a steadiness that would not last the night. The cliff, when it came, was quiet. Craddock's hand on her sleeve, his whisper meant only for her. The 1911 will, he said. It names a beneficiary. It is not Harriet Peveril alone. There are two names on the line. The second was inked over by Harbottle long ago. But under the lamp, if you look, you can read it. Who? She asked, and he said it, and the wind outside rattled the window in delight or dread. Cyril. Good fellow, he said. The vicar. Chapter 10. The story. Everyone swore was true. The church was still heavy with candle smoke when the last notes of the hymn faded into silence. Constables moved the villagers out gently, like shepherds hurrying a flock before a storm could break again. Faces craned and whispered, and by the time the door shut behind the final coat and shawl, rumour had already begun its journey down the lane to the cottages. Harbottle's murder, the vanishing will, the organist dragged from the loft, it would all be retold by every fireside before dawn. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, none of it would be told as it had truly happened. A tale once loosed quickly became the story everyone swore was true. Inspector Craddock had settled Linton in one pew under guard and Jeffries in another, while Harriet Hart, Harriet Peveril, as she had confessed, sat pale and resolute in the blue parlour, her hands still. Hugh Peveril had gone out into the night with the expression of a man newly introduced to his own. Reflection. Only Mrs. Arbuthnot remained composed, though her shawl had slipped and her hands trembled more than she allowed. It was into this quiet aftermath that the discovery of the 1911 will had fallen like a stone in still water. Craddock had whispered the name to Miss Marple, Cyril Goodfellow, and the church bell had rung, echoing the syllables as though heaven itself wished to confirm them. Now, in the silence of the vestry, Craddock opened the packet with a penknife, while Miss Marple bent, closer, her eyes alert. The document was yellowed, its ink faded, but the words were still legible. Dorothea Arbuthnot's hand, firm and elegant, naming her estate to be divided equally between Harriet Peveril, her ward, and Cyril Goodfellow. Then a young curate in her household and companion to her husband's evenings of theology. At the bottom, Harbottle's cramped hand had noted to be superseded upon marriage settlement, unless otherwise directed. Craddock exhaled. The vicar. Our mild, apologetic tea-spilling vicar. He looked doubtful, almost unwilling. It doesn't sit. It rarely does, Miss Marple said gently. That is why it is effective. She tapped the paper with one finger. Consider, Inspector, Mr. Goodfellow has been in this village for 20 years and more, a model of harmlessness. He would never, so everyone says. And yet, he alone held the keys, he alone was in the church when Harbottle died, and he alone was the last to see him alive. What more natural than to dismiss the possibility? Craddock frowned. You suspect him? I suspect the story everyone has agreed upon, Miss Marple said. That Harbottle collapsed alone, that the vicar merely found him, that he was too flustered to recall details. The village has told it so often they believe it, even though none of them were present. The wind moaned through the chancel arch. Miss Marple straightened slowly. We must hear the story again, but this time in the teller's own words, not as embroidered by his neighbours. They did not need to summon him. Cyril Goodfellow appeared at the vestry door himself, his coat damp with mist, and his face set in anxious lines. Inspector, he said in his mild, apologetic way, I came as soon as I could. There is talk in the village, a dreadful muddle about wills and accusations. I thought I had best present myself before anything worse is imagined. Craddock eyed him keenly. You are wise, Vicar. Sit down. Tell us again what occurred the night Harbottle died. Every word. From the beginning. The vicar obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as though expecting to be scolded. It was late, he began, and I had been finishing some parish accounts in the vestry. Mr. Harbottle came in, quite unexpectedly. He said he had documents that must be secured. He was most insistent. He placed a packet under the flagstone, muttering about secrecy, then began to pace, agitated. I tried to calm him, offered him tea, but he grew more heated. Suddenly, he clutched, his chest, staggered, and fell. I confess I was paralysed. I could not move to aid him. By the time I fetched help, it was too late. His voice wavered, and he clasped his hands as if in prayer. Miss Marple watched him with bright interest. A curious thing, Mr. Goodfellow, she said softly. You say he placed a packet under the flagstone, yet when we lifted it, no packet remained. Do you recall what it looked like? The vicar frowned. Why, no, except that it was tied with white tape. But that is not unusual. Not unusual at all, Miss Marple agreed. And when he fell, did he speak? Cry out? Only a gasp, the vicar murmured, as if he meant to say a word but could not. Craddock leaned forward. And you told this to no one? I was ashamed, the vicar admitted, his face pale. Ashamed of my own weakness. The village knows me as timid. I let them believe it. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew a half-finished sock from her bag. Sometimes, Mr. Goodfellow, a reputation for timidity is very useful. People expect nothing of you. They trust you with keys, with confidences, and when a man dies in your care, they accept at once that you were too flustered to do otherwise. The vicar's eyes widened. Surely you do not. Miss Marple, I am no murderer. She smiled kindly. I should like to believe that. Yet belief is a dangerous thing. It makes a story stick even when it is untrue. Craddock interrupted. The will of 1911 names you as heir, vicar, along with Miss Harriet Peveril. That is motive enough. Goodfellow's lips moved soundlessly. I had forgotten. I never imagined. Surely Mrs. Arbuthnot would have changed it, Miss Marple finished gently. Indeed she did, many times, but perhaps the older paper was more convenient for someone, and convenient papers have a way of resurfacing when need presses. Silence thickened. The lantern flame guttered. Outside, the storm pressed its weight against the leaded panes. At last, the vicar whispered, "If you truly believe this of me, then God help me. But I swear on my soul, I never laid a hand on Mr. Harbottle." Miss Marple studied him a moment longer. "Perhaps not. But I wonder, Mr. Goodfellow, whether your sin is not of commission, but omission. A man who watches another die when he might have prevented it is not less guilty, and a man who hides the truth because it serves him is guilty still." The vicar's face crumpled, but before he could answer, the door burst open. Harriet stood there, pale as parchment, a folded page in her hand. "Inspector, Miss Marple, the journal. I had hidden another leaf. I meant to burn it, but I cannot. You must see." She thrust the page forward. Craddock seized it, eyes narrowing as he read aloud. 12:25, vicar present, saw everything, did not intervene. 12:27, agreed silence. 12:30, packet secured, not same as before. All eyes turned to Goodfellow. He rose unsteadily, his lips working. "It is true," he whispered. "I was there. I saw Harbottle struggle. I did nothing. He had threatened to expose me, to tell the village of my weakness for certain debts. I let him fall. Afterwards I moved the packet to another hiding place. I thought, oh, God forgive me, I thought no one would know." Miss Marple's needles stilled. "But someone did know. Someone who wrote this in the journal. Someone who wished your silence to bind you to theirs." The vicar bowed his head. "Yes, Harriet. She warned me to keep quiet. She said the truth would destroy us. Both. I believed her." Harriet's face hardened. "I told you to keep silent because the truth would have destroyed Mrs. Arbuthnot. She could not bear another scandal. You were weak, Cyril, and I protected you." "Protected yourself," Craddock snapped. "Protected your claim." But Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the vicar. "So the story everyone swore was true, that Harbottle collapsed alone, was a lie. You were there, Mr. Goodfellow. You watched, and then you moved the packet. That makes you central to everything. The question is, what was in that second packet, and who placed it?" The vicar swallowed hard. "I cannot say. I hid it beneath the organ loft, behind the pipes. But when I returned later, it was gone." "Gone," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very convenient. And yet, convenient stories have a way of unravelling. Threads, Inspector, threads." She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose. "The truth lies not in what everyone repeats, but in what no one dares to say. And I believe we shall find it soon, very soon." Craddock pressed the journal page flat against the table. "Enough of stories. We'll have evidence. Tomorrow we search the church from steeple to crypt. If there's a hiding place left, we'll find it. And if the packet appears again, there'll be no doubt whose hand placed it." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Perhaps it will appear sooner than that, for lies, like ghosts, cannot keep their silence long." The vestry door banged with a gust of wind, startling them all. And in that moment, as the lantern flickered, Miss Marple noticed a scrap of paper that had fluttered loose from the 1911 will, brittle and half torn. She picked it up carefully. The ink was faded, but 2 words could still be read, underlined twice in Harbottle's hand: "Secret heir." She looked up, her expression grave. "Inspector, I believe we are about to learn that the story everyone swore was true is the greatest lie of all, and the true heir, whoever it may be, has yet to show their hand. The storm rattled the vestry windows like an impatient fist, and Craddock swore softly. "Then God help us all," he muttered. because tomorrow will bring the reckoning. Chapter 11. The Confession. Miss Marple never asked for the rain returned at 2 in the morning as if it had been merely out for air, and St. Mary Mead shrank deeper into its blankets. Miss Marple, who was not asleep, heard it begin as a soft stroke and turned determined. She lit a candle and read a line of a book she had read before. Not for the plot. Plots were for the young, but for the comfort of knowing what would come next. That was when the knock sounded at her door. 3 quick taps, the last. A falter, like a man who began with courage and finished with honesty. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and opened the door herself. The vicar stood beyond the threshold, cap in hand, and rain like tears on his coat. The lamplight made of his face a responsible ghost. "Miss Marple," he said, and his voice fought between whisper and cry. "I must say something. If I do not, I shall go on being the sort of man I have apparently always been, and I cannot endure him any longer." "Then come in," said Miss Marple, because a confession does not like the cold. "Sit by the fire, Mr. Goodfellow, and do not begin until your fingers have found out they are not in the rain." He obeyed with the docility of the overburdened. The flames took the water from his sleeves in little applauses. He did not warm his hands, he twined them, priest with penitent, and no one between. "I have lied," he said, before she could offer him tea. "Not in words, but in what I allowed to be thought. I was in the vestry when Harbottle died. That much you drew from me already. But I did more than fail to help a man who might have lived. I moved what he hid." "Yes," Miss Marple said, because gentleness need not be imprecise. He flinched, and then the words came because they could not do other. "He came to me in a temper I had seen only in men in barracks years ago. He said there were papers that would end quarrels and begin others. He made a show of the flagstone, as if he were in a melodrama. I counselled him to daylight and witnesses. He laughed and called me a man who liked the sound of his own prayers. He set a packet under the flag, and then he reeled. I think he meant to say a name. I did nothing. I have preached of mercy and did not remember how to perform it. When I came back with the boy from the rectory, he sleeps in the little room. I wanted someone, anyone. Harbottle was beyond my help. I sat with him like a coward. I did not wish the village to know I had not tried. I told myself I was preserving Mrs. Arbuthnot's peace. I lifted the flag, took what he had meant to put there. No, I took what he had put there, and I carried it into the church and hid it behind the organ pipes. It seemed to me a place God might keep secrets for a while. When I went again, at dawn, it was gone. He stopped. The rain performed in the chimney. Miss Marple set the teapot nearer the coals. There is no comfort like the little noises made by water obliged to become useful. "Do you know," she asked mildly, "what you hid?" "A will," he said, hating the word. "Or so I thought. Tied with tape. I did not read it." "Then you hid a bundle of blank foolscap," she said, and watched the truth strike him. He shut his eyes as if light hurt. "Someone switched it. I had a thief's hand in a thief's business and thought myself discreet." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And you were seen, because tidy people see everything that needs correction. You have been, Mr. Goodfellow, tidied. That is what it is to be useful to A. Certain consciences." He bowed his head. "There is worse, Miss Marple. Harbottle threatened me. There were debts, small but squalid. He knew. He liked knowing. He said I would be named in a paper I had no right to be in. He laughed at my being a curate with a legacy. It was indecent. For a moment, a breath only. I was relieved to see him fall. "That," said Miss Marple, "is the confession you never need to make to me. There is not a person in this village who has not been briefly glad to be saved. A difficult conversation. He made a sound that might have been a laugh borrowing sorrow's coat, and yet you would have me confess to the inspector. To the truth, said Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock is not the truth. He is only a man with a better pencil. He did not smile. There is more. I did not go to the church alone when I moved the packet. Harriet came with me. Harriet Peveril. He nodded. She knew. She knew before I did. She appeared in the passage with a candle, with that way she has of arriving where one is most ashamed. She told me I must be silent. She would take the burden. She did what she could. She is not. He stopped, because he had nearly said virtuous or good and knew better. She has always done what is necessary for Mrs. Arbuthnot. And for herself, Miss Marple said, because one must put both plates on the table. He rose with the jerky grace of a man who has finished a painful thing and wishes to flee it. I could not sleep until I had told you. I am ready to be despised. You will never be despised in this village, said Miss Marple not cheerfully. You will be forgiven and remembered. That is worse. He put his cap back on, gave her a look of such naked gratitude that she had to look away to the teapot, and left. She listened to his footsteps until the rain took them. Then she poured herself tea, which had drawn too long and grew moral about it. She did not drink it. She had been given without asking the confession she had wanted, least. It did not make her task easier. It made it fairer. By 9 the morning had the watery bravery of a child who says it is not cold. Craddock, who had slept less than decency demanded, met her in the church porch with a determination that looked almost light-hearted because it had fought despair and won on points. He confessed to you, he said without preface. He did, to omission, to movement, to cowardice, not to murder. He would not, Craddock said. He is that sort. Jeffreys I have. Shut up with his vox humana. Linton blusters and trembles alternately. Mrs. Arbuthnot grows Queen Elizabeth at odd intervals and then remembers herself an invalid. Hugh is at large with his conscience. Harriet is as tidy as Providence. Miss Marple looked past him to the nave, empty and clean as a schoolroom. We shall require 2 things, Inspector. A ladder, and your ability to read a palimpsest. He blinked. A what? A writing beneath a writing, she said. Beneath this village there is another, and beneath that a very old one. We are obliged to read at least 2. He brought the ladder. She brought with her a venerable pencil and a sheet of thin paper. In the blue parlour, with the portrait open like a mouth that had decided to speak, she laid the paper over the writing-table's blotter, where the day before a heavy hand had pressed lines of Mr. Harbottle's temper. She shaded gently, not the whole, only the corners where people who think they are careful rest their wrists. Words came in the manner that words do when coaxed from pride, stare, hollow, stringer, and the tail of a sentence that stopped because the telephone, or the storm, or a woman had interrupted it. Beneath the staircase, Craddock said without triumph. Beneath the staircase, Miss Marple agreed. He wrote a note to himself about where something was to be hidden, or had been. He pressed hard. He always presses hard when he wants to assert possession. She moved the paper an inch. A new ghost of line rose. Seal with locket. She did not need the word. She saw the old lady's chain in memory, the locket pressed flat and used as a seal to make respectable what had never been sealed properly. He resealed something, Inspector, with a lady's ornament. Men like Mr. Harbottle cannot resist small desecrations. The first will was sealed with the ring, the later mischief with the locket. The grand staircase, Craddock said, at the hall, lower stringer, hollow. And a tidy woman has likely dusted it 100 times and never thought that in the wood beneath the polish something was sleeping, Miss Marple said. But before we run up the drive like boys on a dare, there is another matter. He was too good to sigh. Which? "The story everyone swears is true," she said. "We must listen to it carefully and see where each singer breathes." They did not have long to wait. St. Mary Mead's morning is a gossip's opportunity. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had the qualities of a minor witch and the moral fibre of a tired accountant, waylaid them at the lich gate. "I will tell you what I have told everyone," she said. "The vicar was always a poor choice. He was of the sort that hides mistakes under prayer books. And Harriet Hart. Oh, I said months ago, in Mrs. Banbury's bow window, that she had the eyes of a woman who has not been married some time and would like to put the world in a drawer and shut it." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, as if she had been offered a recipe that omitted the salt. "You will find," Mrs. Price Ridley went on, "that Mr. Linton has taken some money that was not his to smooth, and that Mr. Jeffreys has smoked where he should not and corrected what God put crooked. But as for Mr. Hugh, he is a laughing matter only if one likes laughter that smells of whiskey. He would pocket a crown from a dead man if he thought it was a kindness to the dead." Miss Marple thanked her as if she had been a library and went on. "Do you see," she said to Craddock when they had escaped. "Each tells the story that makes them right. Not one of them mentions the one thing that is true. And that is that strength and weakness are not where we place them. We think Harriet strong because she is tidy. But tidiness is only the courage of people who are afraid of disorder. We think the vicar weak because he is gentle, but gentleness allowed him to do a cruel thing with a clean conscience. We think Mrs. Arbuthnot frail, but she has directed many of the lines we are now required to read." Craddock looked at the hall as if it were a book he would prefer in summary. "Shall we go and see what Mr. Harbottle wrote to himself about the staircase?" "We shall," Miss Marple said, "and you must bring Mr. Linton, for he knows the wood and which of it rings hollow." Linton came unwilling, but with the obedience of a man whose life has been arranged by systems. He had put on a clean collar, the wax on his cuff would not be persuaded to depart, and therefore had covered itself with a bandage of story. He hated the ladder less than Miss Marple had expected. He loved important equipment in the way men love props. He tapped the left-hand stringer of the grand staircase just above the third tread with the butt of a screwdriver. The sound came back true. He tapped the right. The note was deadened, as if something lay curled asleep behind it. "Here," he said, "but you will ruin the varnish." "We will rescue a life," Miss Marple said. "Varnish can be forgiven." High prized delicately at the beading. It lifted too easily, as if it were a strip that had been off and on a dozen times and resented only the effort. Beneath lay, embedded in the hollow, a small cavity lined with velvet the colour of wine, faded where fingers had taken, replaced, and taken again. Within, flat as gilt, lay two papers, one sealed with red wax broken and resealed with brown dab pressed by a locket face, one newer, Harbottle's legal ribbons slitting it like a throat. Craddock did not touch them at once. The air about them felt like the silence in a nursery when a child is just asleep. Miss Marple, who had lifted a paper off a sleeping child's chest, once and never forgiven herself for the cough it woke, let the inspector be the man he was. He took out the older paper, reading the title without reading the text. "Dorothea Arbuthnot, 1911, he said, and laid it down reverently as if it were a relic. He took out the second. "Codicil, dated last Tuesday," he read. "Revoking, disposition in favour of Hugh Peveril, creating a trust for—" He stopped, because the habit of theatricality is common even in the most decent. "For whom?" Miss Marple said. "For the secret heir," he said softly, "named here in full. Harriet Peveril, and Cyril Goodfellow in trust for—" He read the name and then said it aloud because there are times when saying a thing to the heir is kinder than putting it in another person's ear directly. "For the child of Dorothea Arbuthnot, and—" swallowed. "And the man who was her curate." "I had thought so," Miss Marple said. "It is the easiest sin for a woman with too much loneliness and a man with too much admiration in a silent house. The will brought him here and the paper sent him away again." Mr. Harbottle thought to hold the house over them as a lantern and watch the moths. Linton made a small noise. "Who, then? Is the child Harriet?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Harriet is the daughter of a sister, taken in and labelled as a ward, and made into a tidying instrument. It has always been that way." She touched the locket that Mrs. Arbuthnot wore, the one that had acted unlawfully as a seal. "The hair within is Dorothea's own, kept as one keeps a portion of oneself when one intends to give the rest away." "Then who?" Craddock pressed. Miss Marple turned her head because one does not pronounce certain names inside a house that has enjoyed not knowing. She looked up the stair and saw, very far up and very small, Mrs. Arbuthnot on the landing, a shawl about her and her hand on the rail as if it were memory. Beside her stood Harriet, as if she had always been placed there, to the right of power. "It is not a woman," Miss Marple said softly. "It is not the one who has been accused of being the wrong sort of daughter. It is the man who has been the wrong sort of son." "Hugh," Linton blurted, startled into the truth he had feared and despised in equal measure. Miss Marple did not look at him. "The village story says Hugh is the grandson by marriage and therefore safe to dislike. The paper says he is Dorothea's child. It is why she indulged him beyond justice and why she punished him beyond decency. It is why Mr. Harbottle laughed to see him swagger. He knew the name that ought to be stitched into that hat. The hat that bore H.P. Harriet Peveril was meant to lead us away. But the real H.P. was Hugh Peveril, if one wished not to write Arbuthnot. Bastardy is very easy to tidy if one has the right letters." Craddock let out the slow breath of a man who is about to spend the next hour being sworn at in silence for something he did not do. "And the murder?" he said quietly. "We have led the village through candles and cards and hat-boxes. We have a man who stood and did not help, another who corrected what God saw fit to leave wrong, a steward who burns what he ought not and buys what he should not, a woman who can tie knots that bind better than ropes, who put his hand to Mr. Harbottle's life and took it." Miss Marple looked at the wax scar on Linton's cuff, at the nicotine on Jeffreys's fingers in memory, at the vicar's pale mouth, at Harriet's neat profile above on the landing, at Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand on the rail, small, stubborn, and beautiful in its cruelty. "The person who could not bear," she said softly, "to let Harbottle speak the name of her child. He had come to gloat. He would have said it in the vestry where the village's brass remembers other names. He was vain. He was theatrical. He would have enjoyed it. She could not let him." Linton made a sound of shocked contempt, as if age were a talisman against crime. Craddock did not speak at all. Miss Marple went to the landing with the courtesy one gives royalty and criminals in their drawing-rooms. "Madam," she said, and because she had never called her by her Christian name, she did not now. "We have found papers that say what you could not. I do not ask you whether you put your hand to Mr. Harbottle's life. I ask you whether when he reeled, you steadied him in a direction he did not intend." Mrs. Arbuthnot looked down at her as one looks down from a past to a present it has made. Her face was composed. It had not needed Harriet's tidy hands this morning to arrange it. "He would have spoiled everything," she said. "He would have said Hugh's name. He would have said Cyril's. He would have made of my house a town hall. He had that sort of amusement. He had the sort of mercy that must be attended by an audience. I could not permit it. He had a neck like a chicken. It is very odd," she added conversationally, "what one remembers from childhood." Harriet took a step as if to place herself between them. Mrs. Arbuthnot did not let her. "I have done worse than this," she said. "I have let a girl I love become a nurse in my house so that she might have a piece of what was not given to her." I have let a boy learn meanness because I wished to pretend it was high spirits. I am an old woman. I cannot confess properly. I cannot kneel. You will not have to, Miss Marple said gently. You will sit and write down every act of last Tuesday, from the candle to the locket, and you will sign it with your good pen, the one that does not spit. Craddock came up 3 steps and stopped because dignity had to stop somewhere. Mrs. Arbuthnot, he began, and then he remembered that the law has a way of making itself odious in very short sentences. Madam, he amended, we will need you to come to the Bar Vestry. It began there, she said. It may end there. She looked down the stairs, a small woman and firm. Harriet will bring my shawl. Hugh. She did not finish his name. It was either a blessing or a criticism. It had the weight of both. Hugh, who had materialized like guilt at the foot of the stairs, did not move. He had heard enough. His face was ash-coloured and suddenly young. He looked not at Mrs. Arbuthnot but at Harriet. She did not look back. When a woman has spent years not looking, in order not to see, she cannot resume at once. Miss Marple thought of the hat with the wrong initials, of the Queen of Hearts that had turned up like a conscience in places where it ought not to be, of Bayberry wax that had travelled with determination from oratory to organ loft to vestry. She thought of the hymn board, and the thread and the blotter, and the hollow of the staircase, where things had slept and dreamed themselves safe. She gathered them all as a woman gathers a sewing basket, and counted the contents. You understand, she said to Craddock, that this is only a story still. Everything here is subject to the villagers' embroidery. You must have the pen to hold it still. I will, he said, and I will be hated by tea-time, and forgiven by Sunday. Not by everyone, Miss Marple said comfortably, but most do not enjoy the taste of resentment with roast beef. They began to come down the stairs together, Mrs. Arbuthnot between Miss Marple and the inspector, Harriet behind, because she had learned to be behind and would have to be taught to walk otherwise. Linton went first because it allowed him to believe he had purpose. At the turn where the staircase doubled on itself and made a little cave, Miss Marple paused. The wood there smelled of beeswax and something older, dust that had been touched by hands that did not dare to leave a mark. She thought of Dorothea Arbuthnot at 20, slipping a paper into the stringer and telling herself it was only for a day. Of Mr. Harbottle at 45, pushing his advantage into the cavity as one pushes a pawn and expecting to have a queen for it. Of Harriet, binding old lies with new tape. Of the vicar, stepping into a space that belonged to courage and finding he had not brought it with him. On the last step, the light from the fanlight over the door made a faded patch on the carpet like a blessing that had lost heart. Craddock handed Mrs. Arbuthnot into her cloak. Harriet tied the ribbon with a knot that would undo easily. She had learned that too, tidiness that did not disgrace mercy. The rain had stopped. The road to the church shone like a wet ribbon laid down for a ceremony. There were already faces at windows. Stories had risen with the bread. Miss Marple preferred confessions made in private to those made in public. But life in St. Mary Mead did not give her everything she preferred. At the lich gate, a boy ran up breathless, the sort that is always exactly where it is improper. Billy held out A.E. folded note. For you, miss, he said. Found under the lodge mat at the hall this morning. Sally says she likes to put her foot on news before she reads it, but she thought you might like your news clean. Miss Marple unfolded it, and all the lines she had made in her mind rearranged themselves with the ease of a child's puzzle, turned once, and found new. The paper was common. The hand was Mr. Harbottle's, neat and hateful. It said, If the codicil be countermanded or stolen, the original instruction remains in the second place, beneath the rectory stair, not the hall. The vicar will not look there. He is tidy in the wrong direction. She lifted her eyes slowly to Mr. Goodfellow, who stood inside the church porch, already smaller because he had chosen to be. His face opened on panic and then closed on something braver. He took a step toward her and stopped. "Inspector," Miss Marple said very softly, "we have been a staircase out." Craddock's jaw set. His hand tightened on the papers he carried. The story everyone swore was true bent in the middle and showed its bones. "Then," he said, "we look beneath the rectory stairs." "And we find," Miss Marple murmured, not to make a prophecy but to steady herself for it, "what will turn confession into proof, and the wrong murderer into the right one." Chapter 12. The Secret Beneath the Vestry Floorboards. The rectory staircase gave a thin, old man's groan when Inspector Craddock's men set their crowbars to the second tread. The storm had crossed the village in the night and left everything rinsed and waiting. Dawn showed in the panes as a diluted wash of pewter. Miss Marple stood a little back from the scattering of wood dust, her hands steady on the head of her umbrella. She had told them which tread. She had not said how she knew, only that Mr. Harbottle's hand pressed harder when writing instructions he meant to keep, and that the shadow of those instructions still lay on the vicar's blotter like a bruise. The tread lifted cleanly at last. One of the constables reached into the cavity and drew out a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with white tape, white that was no longer white but the colour of old milk. There was another thing as well, a small envelope that had wedged itself sideways into a seam. Its corner was torn, and the printing along its edge, smudged by time and damp, read, "Pli per S.C." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. She had kept the other torn corner, the one she found beneath the vestry flagstone, the half of a playing card's back. She fitted them together now upon her palm, and they married easily, like rumours that had always belonged. Craddock slit the tape with his knife. Within lay 3 items: a duplicate codicil on Harbottle's paper, his dry little signature neat and hateful at the foot, a letter addressed in Dorothea Arbuthnot's firm, unhurried hand to C.G. to be opened in extremity, and a folded page of Harbottle's private memoranda in which he had itemised the places of concealment he enjoyed using as if they were good jokes performed for himself: vestry flag, organ case, rectory stair, and then a phrase he had underlined twice. If interference suspected, return to first principle. Vestry floorboards. "Floorboards," Craddock repeated, baffled. "It's stone, Miss Marple." "In the church," Miss Marple said. "But Mr. Goodfellow, when he first came, had a little robbing room at the rectory. He called it his vestry because it pleased him. There are still cassock hooks behind the kitchen door. The floor there is boards. Mr. Harbottle's jokes were never quite funny. He meant to keep himself amused with our confusion." She lifted Dorothea's letter by its corner. The seal was impressed with the flat face of the old lady's locket, not a ring. "He resealed this indecently. We shall open it decently." Craddock read the codicil first. It said precisely what the one they had found behind the staircase at the hall had said. The disposition in favour of Hugh Peveril revoked. A trust established until Miss Harriet Peveril's majority, and thereafter in equal division between her and a named natural child. The name written fully, Hugh. Harbottle's hand below as if twitching with satisfaction. To be witnessed in the vicar's presence for propriety. He wanted, always, to be the man at the centre of a stage. "Then Hugh is," Craddock began. "Dorothea's son," Miss Marple finished quietly. "Yes, which makes his swagger not a crime, and his thoughtlessness not a virtue. People behave extravagantly when they have been loved too much and told it too little." "Then who is Harriet?" Craddock asked, though he knew. "Her sister's child," Miss Marple said, "taken in and made to earn affection by being useful. Some women do that. It is their way of making a ledger out of love. Dorothea wanted both children and punished both in turn. Craddock looked toward the door, where a constable waited with his cap in his hands and the village in his throat. "We will read the letter," he said roughly, "and then we will ask Mrs. Arbuthnot to tell us what she has not told. But first, your floorboards." The vestry at the rectory was a modest cupboard of a room leading off the scullery, boarded 2 inches above the flagged floor, likely to keep cassocks from damp. The boards had the sheen of long scrubbing. Mrs. Goodfellow, dead these 10 years, had been an exact woman. Craddock's men eased up the centre plank. The smell that rose was of clean wood and old paper. Within were 2 flat leather pocketbooks. Craddock lifted the first. Inside lay a sheaf of receipts and notes made out to Cyril Goodfellow in Harbottle's hand. Small debts, petty humiliations, the slender whip a man keeps for a weaker man. The second held a baptismal entry in Dorothea's hand. The vicar had never copied it into the parish register, with the name Hugh written in a shaking firmness and a line drawn through the father's name until the paper broke and the truth could be read in the white tear beneath. Cyril. Miss Marple's glance went to the doorway where Goodfellow stood by necessity. He had come when sent for, because he had always come when summoned. His face had the colour of milk that has boiled and been pulled from the flame too late. "You knew this would be written somewhere," Miss Marple said gently, "but not with your name. Secrets are like cats. They prefer to lie on the person who dislikes them." The vicar made a small, honest movement of the hand, as if to push hair from his eyes, and in that motion Miss Marple saw again what she had noticed idly 12 times. Cyril Goodfellow was left-handed. He had lifted the bell-pull at Harvest Festival with his left hand. He poured from the right-spouted teapot with a left-hand confidence that did not splash. The bunting at the summer fete had been tied with left-handed hitches. Miss Marple remembered because she always noticed the ways people had of doing small things. Large crimes hide in such habits. They brought Dorothea's letter to the vicarage parlour, where coal burned and refused to cheer. Mrs. Arbuthnot was there already, arranged upright and diminishing no one by virtue of her size. Harriet stood at her shoulder. Hugh lingered by the door as if uncertain from which side he ought to enter. Mr. Linton arrived, because stewards go where papers go. Mr. Jeffreys was left to his organ, under guard with his pipe trays and outraged stops. It pleased Miss Marple to gather the living around the dead man's paper. The wrongdoer prefers privacy. A crowd has a way of finding a person's right shape. Craddock broke the seal. The first lines were practical in that Dorothea way that did not allow feeling to interrupt organising. "If this be read, Harbottle has failed me, which is more in his nature than anything he calls fidelity. Let it be known that H is mine by love and mistake. Let him be relieved of pretence, and his debts paid in sense." There was mention of Harriet, "my sister's child who has kept me tidy. I have not been kind, only orderly. See that she has the order of her own choosing." Then, as though the pen had stopped resisting and the heart took it in hand, the old woman wrote the sentence Miss Marple had expected and dreaded. "If Harbottle would make a show of my sin, I will not have it. My house shall close his mouth." Harriet made a quick intake of breath. Hugh, who had put his chin up, let it sink. Goodfellow flinched as if his name had been a thrown stone. Mrs. Arbuthnot, and this was her courage, did not move at all. "Madam," Miss Marple said in the little hush, "we are obliged to discover whether you closed his mouth with your hand." "I thought I did," the old lady said with a simplicity that was almost childlike. "Is that not the same as doing it?" "No," Miss Marple returned, and there was an odd kindness in it. "The sin of intention is for God. The law concerns itself with knots." Craddock, who preferred rope to metaphysics, had taken up the bell rope from the vestry that a constable had brought on his order. Its lower end showed where a splice had been made only recently, the fibres of the old silk showing their age, the new hemp bright and incongruous like a loud cousin in a quiet room. The splice had been tied by a left-hander. The lay of it, the turn, announced the habit to anyone who had ever watched a man make a reef knot backwards at a school bazaar. Miss Marple said very quietly, when Mr. Harbottle reeled, the person who stepped behind him had already looped the rope. It is quicker that way, and a tidy man likes his arrangements ready to hand. The knot is left-handed. Mr. Goodfellow, will you tell them what you told me? Not about failing to help, about helping too late. It was the vicar's turn to be brave. He stood straighter than his body wished and did not make his voice small. He laughed, he said, looking not at any of them, but at the point in the air where a man looks when he confesses to God and not to people. He called my name. He said he would read it from the pulpit, if I pleaded. He turned to the door and I put the rope about his throat and pulled. It was not long. He clawed at it, and when he fell I let him fall. I thought, foolishly, that I had spared us all. Afterwards I prayed. I have been praying since. I told Miss Marple last night about my weakness because I wished her to despise me less. She was kind enough not to oblige me. You were cunning enough, Miss Marple said without sourness, to offer half a truth to a woman you thought would be satisfied with it. But people my age have had a lifetime of boys telling us they have washed behind their ears. You cannot unlearn that familiarity. Harriet moved as if to speak. The old lady made the smallest motion with her hand, permission and refusal in, on. Hugh spoke instead, and turned the room into something a little better than it had been. If I had been a man, he said slowly, I would have stopped him. Not the vicar, not Harbottle, myself. I should have stopped myself years ago. I have been relieved of a fortune and given a childhood. It is an odd exchange. I suppose I shall learn to accept it. Miss Marple looked at him with the fondness elderly women have for men who decide to learn late. You will begin by apologizing to Harriet, she said pleasantly, for being an unkind boy while she did your work. Then you will take Mr. Linton's accounts and perform them correctly for a year. It is not a hanging matter, but it is a discipline. Craddock cleared his throat. Mr. Goodfellow, I must ask you to accompany me. You will make a statement, including the place you hid the rope after you tidied your crime. Goodfellow's face altered, not with panic now, but with the awful ease of acceptance. Under the rectory stair, he said, and then, because accuracy had always been his failing and his pride, on top of the pocketbook, not under. I have been stepping over it all week. Very human, Miss Marple murmured. Harriet spoke at last. He did it for us, she said to Dorothea in a low voice, anger and pity together. He did a wicked thing for our sakes. Dorothea looked down at her hands. He did a wicked thing because he was a man who had never been required to be one, and then was required all at once, she said. We will not tell stories to make it prettier. The parish would tell them all the same, Miss Marple thought. It was already telling them at the pump. She had seen Mrs. Price Ridley on the way in, her mouth full of wool ready for knitting and news. Craddock took the vicar away gently, because there are times when kindness costs nothing and buys decency for everyone. Mr. Linton made a number of important statements to the effect that he had been imposed upon by cleverer people and interrupted, himself often in case someone contradicted him. Jeffreys was fetched and discharged officially from his office and allowed to keep his outrage for private consumption. The constables folded back the tread at the rectory. The house put itself together in the manner houses do after humiliations, by making tea. It was then Miss Marple asked to be left alone for a quarter hour in the church vestry. The floorboards, she said mildly to Craddock as he hesitated. Mr. Harbottle said first. Principles. The vestry was as it had always been, square, stern, older than anyone's memory. Up the tower the ropes hung like a row of quiet scholars, chastened into decorum. The stone flag where Harbottle had performed his melodrama lay closed and quiet. Beneath the window the floor had boards raised upon battens to keep the damp off registers. The battens themselves were notched, as though a sound mind had cut a place for a hand to lift easily. Miss Marple knelt and put her hand there. No one on earth could have said why the batten should have moved beneath her fingers, except that she had spent a lifetime touching things that are supposed to be still. The board lifted softly. Beneath lay a small cavity. Within was not paper. It was a little tin, a cheap confectionery box once, painted with a shepherdess more vulgar than the shepherdesses in the blue parlour. It rattled when she picked it up. She opened it and saw, nested in cotton wool, 4 things. A key, the Temple Press Queen of Issy hearts, this one with its face unblemished. A scrap of wax gone brittle and the colour of bay leaves. And an envelope addressed to Miss Jane Marple in Harbottle's crabbed hand. The envelope had been written and then perhaps thought better of. His line had been drawn through her name once, lightly, as if his vanity could not tolerate a woman's being required to finish his puzzle after all. And then the line had been rubbed away with the care of someone who wanted to be rescued, but had too much pride to knock. Miss Marple read the little note there and then, because at her age one never leaves for later what later may remove. Madam, if you are reading this, the village has had its sport, and I my due. I say with such candour as I possess that I have never liked you. You have the habit of giving truth away free of charge. Know this. I laid traps because I could not resist the shame of being shown wrong. The vicar is weak, the steward obedient, the nurse exact. The murderer is the person who ties a left-handed splice and then writes sermon notes with the same hand. Set your little threads where you please. I leave you a key because even I do not know which lock it will best fit. She smiled, at the insolence, at the accuracy, at the craven little flourish by which a vain man contrives to be useful when usefulness allows him to speak again. The key was of the old parish type, made to fit more locks than good sense permits. It would open the little iron chest in the tower where registers had once been kept, the oratory's side aumbry door, the vestry cupboard. It would unlock, if one wished, a number of small hearts. She replaced everything exactly, except the letter she had already read. She never stole. She sometimes borrowed and was not always punctual about the return. She lowered the board and went to the window and stood for a moment with her hand upon the sill. The faint green, Bayberry again, marked the stone like a signature. Tidy crimes have their vanities. When she returned to the hall, the house looked as if a portrait had been rehung. Servants were walking with a little more sound. When silence has broken, there is permission for lesser noises. Harriet stood in the morning room, arranging medicines she did not intend to use. Dorothea sat with her shawl about her and a blank page upon the writing table. She had put away the good pen and chosen a pencil that would rub out if she required it. Hugh came in late, hatless, his hair wet from the insistence of learning to do things in the rain. "I have written a note to the bishop," Dorothea said to Miss Marple, before Miss Marple could ask. "It is not a confession. It is a correction." She tapped the blank page. "I find at the end that the most one can do for a house is write what is true of it and leave the lie to those who prefer it." Miss Marple set the little tin upon the table and opened it so that they could see the queen and the wax and the key and know that a dead man had marked them for an audience. "Mr. Harbottle," she said, "liked finales. I am not certain he deserves one, but we shall give it to him." Craddock came back at tea-time with his collar, as it had been in the morning, but his expression less burdened. "Mr. Goodfellow has made his statement in full," he said. "He will be charged." He looked almost apologetic to Dorothea. "I am sorry, madam. It is a hard thing in Advent. Dorothea lifted her head. I have always preferred hard things at the proper season, she said. The soft things come by themselves and leave a mess. Harriet, who had not cried, touched the tray to be sure everything stood as it should. Mrs. Arbuthnot's supper will be in the small parlour at 7. She will take the draught to help her sleep. I will not, Dorothea said tartly. And then, because the house had resumed the habit of small truth-telling, I will, of course, if you insist. Miss Marple took a final tour of the blue parlour while the tray went out and the kettle muttered like a village woman in the scullery. The portrait had been rehung. The velvet backing had the little crease it would carry forever, a wrinkle that would make some future housemaid purse her lips. The writing table lay as bare as decency permitted. She touched the edge once out of habit, and in that act saw, not on the table, but in the reflection in the glass of the cabinet, what she had missed an hour before because she had not thought to look toward prettiness for truth. The locket on Dorothea's chain, laid down carelessly near the blotter while Harriet measured a draught, was not the one Dorothea had always worn. It was the same shape, the same old-fashioned oak leaf, but the clasp showed a particle of greened wax lodged like a thought that could not be shaken, and the face bore the faintest scoring, as if a man without a ring had pressed it against paper again and again to make authority where he did not have it. Miss Marple slipped it up with her little finger and saw, beneath the lid, a nurse's ribbon. The curl was Harriet's first, from a child who had been kept tidy before she had been loved. Miss Marple? Harriet stood at the door. Her face had its old correctness and something like relief upon it, which is what happens when a house has been stripped down to its last decent sheet. I was only thinking, Miss Marple said, and replaced the locket and smoothed the blotter because smoothing is forgiveness in little. You will not take the Bayberry candles out of the oratory again. No, Harriet said. I shall let the dark be dark. Miss Marple went home in the early dark that had the smell of doused wax and rain on stone. St. Mary Mead had already composed a version of events in which the organist had been a villain, the vicar a fool, the nurse a termagant, and the old lady a saint. By Sunday the order would change to suit the hymn. It did not trouble Miss Marple. Villages cannot abide blank spaces. They fill them. Her work was to leave the right outlines where embroidery could do least harm. At her own gate she found Billy waiting, his cap in his hands, and a face full of the importance a small boy gains from being entrusted with envelopes. "Another, miss," he said, half proud, half scared. "Sally says it was under the church door this time, like it had crawled there." Miss Marple took it. The paper was cheap, the writing was small and delicate, and she recognised it. The clerk's from Harbottle's office, imitating another hand as a joke he ought not to have played. Inside lay a single card, the Queen of Hearts again, Temple Press Series C, and a note in a tidy female hand she also knew too well to forget. One queen remains unturned. The lady in the portrait is not the only woman who pressed a seal where a ring should have been. Miss Marple stood very still in the lane while the village went about its washing up around her. She turned the card in her fingers. Her face did not alter, but her eyes lost their gentleness for a breath. Then she slipped the card into her reticule, put a hand on Billy's shoulder because boys treasure such economies of kindness, and went inside to light her lamp. She did not hurry. She would make tea first. Threads should not be snatched. They should be drawn until the cloth shows willingly what pattern it has been forced to keep.